Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The moment I pulled away the moth-eaten cloth, I should have covered it back up. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some reflections are meant to stay hidden. But the house had already started whispering its secrets, and I was fool enough to listen. The Thornfield estate came to me through a will I barely understood, inherited from a great aunt I'd met exactly twice in my 34 years. Martha Thornfield had been the family's black sheep, the one who never married, never left the crumbling Victorian mansion that squatted like a diseased toad on 40 acres of overgrown Massachusetts woodland. When the lawyer handed me the keys with barely concealed relief, he mentioned that the house had been empty for 3 months since her passing. What he didn't mention was the way the floorboards groaned with each step, as if the house itself was in pain, or how the walls seemed to lean inward when you weren't looking directly at them. I'd planned to stay just long enough to assess what could be salvaged and sold. The first 2 days passed uneventfully enough. I cataloged furniture, sorted through decades of accumulated belongings, and tried to ignore the persistent feeling that someone was watching me from the corners of my vision. It was an old house. Old houses made noises, cast strange shadows, held onto the past with stubborn fingers. On the third day, I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. The air up there hung thick and stagnant, heavy with dust motes that danced in the pale afternoon light filtering through a single grimy window. Boxes lined the walls like sleeping sentries, and furniture draped in white sheets created a landscape of ghostly humps and valleys. But it was the shape in the far corner that drew my attention. A tall rectangle covered in what looked like layers of dark fabric, bound with rope that had grown brittle with age. My hands trembled slightly as I worked at the knots. The rope crumbled at my touch, releasing a smell like old flowers and something else, something organic and unsettling. When the final binding fell away, I pulled the cloth aside in one swift motion. The mirror stood 7 feet tall, its surface untarnished despite what must have been decades of concealment. The frame was ornate Victorian silver, crawling with carved roses and thorns that seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. But it was my reflection that made my blood run cold. I stood there staring at myself, but the man in the mirror didn't raise his hand when I did. For a fraction of a second, maybe 2, my reflection lagged behind, creating a nauseating disconnect between action and image. When I stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs, the reflected version of myself completed the movement a beat too late, like an actor who'd missed his cue. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Old mirror, distorted glass, tricks of light. But deep in my gut, in that primitive part of the brain that still remembered when shadows held real dangers, I knew I was looking at something fundamentally wrong. I should have left then, should have covered the mirror and walked away. Instead, I found myself stepping closer. The second time I looked, my reflection seemed more natural, moving in sync with my actual movements. I told myself I'd imagined the delay, that stress and the oppressive atmosphere of the house had played tricks on my perception. But as I stared, the room behind my reflected self began to change. At first, it was subtle. The angle of light seemed different, casting shadows where there shouldn't be any. The boxes stacked behind me appeared to be arranged differently in the mirror, some missing entirely, others appearing where I knew there was empty space. I turned to check the real attic behind me, but everything was exactly as it should be. When I looked back at the mirror, the discrepancies had vanished. My mouth went dry, and I could taste the copper tang of adrenaline on my tongue. The smart thing would have been to leave, but something kept me rooted in place, staring into that impossible reflection. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and compress around me like taffy. That's when I saw her. A figure moved through the reflected attic behind me, just at the edge of the mirror's field of view. An elderly woman in a dark dress, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. She appeared to be searching for something, pulling at boxes, peering into corners with desperate intensity. Her mouth was open as if she was calling out, but no sound reached me from the mirror's surface. I spun around, my heart slamming against my chest so hard I thought it might burst. The attic behind me was empty, silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. But when I turned back to the mirror, she was still there, closer now, her face a mask of frantic desperation. Her eyes, Christ, her eyes, were wide and wild, searching the reflected space with an urgency that made my skin crawl. The woman looked like the photographs I'd seen of Aunt Martha, but distorted, elongated, as if someone had stretched her image on an old television set. She moved with purpose, but also with something that looked like terror, her hands grasping at things I couldn't see in the reflected world. I stumbled backward from the mirror, my legs unsteady, but I couldn't look away. The reflected attic began to change more dramatically now, walls shifting, the single window multiplying into 3, then 5, casting impossible angles of light across surfaces that shouldn't exist. The boxes rearranged themselves in configurations that hurt to look at, stacking in ways that defied physics. And there were others now. More figures moved through the twisted reflection of the attic, men and women in clothing from different eras, all searching, all moving with that same desperate urgency. Some I recognized from old family photographs, relatives who died years or decades before I was born. Others were strangers, their faces gaunt and hungry, their movements predatory. They were looking for something, or someone. As I watched, paralyzed by a terror so complete it felt like drowning, one of the figures, a man in a Civil War-era uniform, turned toward the mirror's surface. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my bladder clench. He reached out, his hand pressing against what should have been the glass from his side, and his mouth opened in what could only be a scream of rage or desperation. But it was his hand that nearly broke my sanity. As he pressed against the mirror's surface, I could see it beginning to bulge outward into the real world, the glass stretching like rubber around his fingers. The surface rippled, and I could swear I felt a change in air pressure, as if something was trying to push through from the other side. I found my voice then, a strangled cry that echoed through the attic as I stumbled away from the mirror. My legs gave out, and I fell hard onto my knees, scraping them against the rough wooden floor. The pain was sharp and immediate, grounding me in reality. When I looked up, the mirror showed only my own reflection, pale and terrified, in an attic that looked exactly as it should. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. If anything, it had intensified. Over the following hours, I tried to convince myself that exhaustion and the stress of inheriting an unfamiliar house had caused some kind of breakdown. I made myself busy with mundane tasks, sorting papers, checking the electrical systems, anything to avoid thinking about what I'd seen. But my eyes kept drifting toward the ceiling, toward the attic above. That night, lying in the master bedroom with every light in the house blazing, I heard sounds from upstairs. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the attic floor. The rational part of my mind suggested settling of old wood, thermal expansion, the normal sounds of an aging house. But I knew better now. I could feel them up there, searching, waiting. I didn't sleep. The next morning, hollow-eyed and shaking from too much coffee and too little rest, I climbed back up to the attic. I told myself I was going to cover the mirror permanently, maybe even have it removed from the house entirely. But when I reached the top of the stairs, the cloth that had originally covered it was draped neatly over a nearby chair, folded with precise care. The mirror stood exposed, its surface reflecting the morning light in ways that seemed wrong, too bright, too clear. And in that clarity, I could see that the reflected attic was no longer empty. They were all there, dozens of figures crowding the impossible space behind the glass. Some stood, some knelt, some pressed their faces against the mirror's surface from the inside. All of them were looking at me with expressions of desperate hunger. Their mouths moved in unison, and though I couldn't hear them, I could read their lips. They were saying my name. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. This wasn't some generalized haunting. They knew who I was. They'd been waiting for me specifically. The inheritance, the timing of Aunt Martha's death, the lawyer's eagerness to be rid of the property, it all suddenly made horrible sense. As I watched, the figures in the mirror began to move with increased agitation. They pointed at me, gesturing frantically, their faces contorting with what looked like rage or desperation. The Civil War soldier pressed both hands against the glass now, and I could see the surface beginning to bow outward again. But it was what happened next that sent me fleeing from the house entirely. My own reflection stepped forward from the crowd of desperate figures. Not a different version of me, not some distorted image. It was exactly me, wearing the same clothes, with the same stubble, the same exhausted expression. But this other me moved independently, turning to face the crowd behind him in the mirror world. And then he smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was something cold and knowing, an expression I'd never worn and never could wear. The other me turned back toward the real mirror surface, pressed his hand against the glass, and mouthed 2 words. "Found you." I ran then, stumbling down the attic stairs, through the house, and out into the gray Massachusetts morning. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until I was 3 states away. The house sits empty now, or so I assume. I never went back, never even called to arrange for the property to be sold. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I catch myself looking at mirrors differently, searching for that telltale delay, that fractional second when my reflection might betray its independence. Because I know now that they found what they were looking for, and I know that somewhere, in a reflected world that exists just on the other side of silvered glass, my other self is still smiling that terrible smile, waiting for the day when the barrier between worlds grows thin enough for him to step through. The worst part isn't the knowledge that he's there, watching and waiting. The worst part is that sometimes, when I'm not paying attention, when I'm tired or distracted, I catch myself smiling that same cold smile back. Story 2. The city's arteries pulse differently after midnight. Streetlights flicker like dying neurons, casting fractured shadows that seem to writhe and breathe. I've been driving these veins for 3 years now, ferrying drunks, insomniacs, and the desperate through the dark hours when honest people sleep. But tonight feels different. Wrong, like the air itself has turned thick and malevolent. My phone buzzes against the dashboard. Another ride request. The notification glows an unsettling blue in my peripheral vision. But when I glance at it, my blood chills. The pickup address is 1847 Elmwood Lane, a house I know doesn't exist anymore. I've driven past that dead-end street countless times. The house at the end burned down 2 years ago, leaving nothing but a charred foundation and twisted metal where a mailbox once stood. I decline the ride. My thumb hovers over the screen for a moment longer than necessary, as if the phone might bite back. The digital display shows 2:17 a.m., and the city feels emptier than usual. Even the perpetual hum of distant traffic seems muted, like the world is holding its breath. The phone buzzes again. Same address, 1847 Elmwood Lane. My heart rate kicks up a notch. I decline again, faster this time. Maybe it's a glitch in the system, some algorithmic hiccup feeding me phantom requests. Technology fails all the time. That's what I tell myself as I pull into a 24-hour gas station parking lot, seeking the comfort of fluorescent lights and human presence. But the attendant behind the bulletproof glass looks wrong somehow. His face is too pale, his movements too slow, like he's underwater. When our eyes meet through the grimy plexiglass, he doesn't nod or wave. He just stares with an expression I can't read, somewhere between pity and dread. The phone buzzes a 3rd time, 4th, 5th. Each notification sends a cold spike through my chest. 1847, Elmwood Lane. 1847, Elmwood Lane. The same address, over and over, like a mantra or a summons. My hands are starting to shake as I grip the steering wheel. The rational part of my brain insists this is just a system error, but something deeper, something primal, whispers that I'm being hunted. By the seventh buzz, sweat is beading on my forehead despite the October chill. My breathing has become shallow, rapid. The confined space of my sedan feels suddenly claustrophobic, the air thick and stale. I crack a window, but the breeze that seeps in carries an odd smell. Not quite smoke, not quite decay, but something that makes my stomach turn. The eighth notification arrives at 2:31 a.m. This time, I don't decline immediately. My thumb hovers over the screen, trembling slightly. The address glows with unusual brightness, as if the pixels themselves are trying to burn their way into my retinas. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I accept the ride. The moment I tap accept, the temperature inside my car drops at least 10 degrees. My breath becomes visible in small puffs, and the radio, which had been playing soft jazz, cuts to static. Through the white noise, I swear I can hear something that sounds almost like whispers, but when I lean closer to listen, there's nothing but electronic hiss. The GPS activates automatically, plotting a route to Elmwood Lane. The blue line on the screen seems to pulse like a vein, and the estimated arrival time reads 0 minutes. That can't be right. Elmwood Lane is at least 15 minutes from here, even without traffic. I pull out of the gas station anyway. My body moves independently of my conscious will, as if something else is driving while I watch from somewhere deep inside my own skull. The streets I've driven thousands of times before look subtly different now. The shadows are deeper, the streetlights dimmer. Buildings that should be familiar seem to lean inward, their windows like empty eye sockets watching my progress. The radio static grows louder as I approach Elmwood Lane. Underneath the white noise, those whispers are becoming more distinct. Not words exactly, but sounds that feel like they're trying to form words inside my head. My scalp prickles, and a cold drop of sweat rolls down my spine. Elmwood Lane appears ahead, looking exactly as I remember it. A narrow, dead-end street lined with overgrown lots and a single working streetlight that flickers intermittently. At the end of the street, where 1847 should be, there's only the burned foundation I've seen dozens of times before. But my phone's GPS insists I've arrived at my destination. The pickup confirmation sound chimes cheerfully, a jarring contrast to the dread pooling in my stomach. According to my app, I've successfully picked up a passenger. The ride is active, the meter is running, but my back seat is empty. I twist around to double check, and the leather seats reflect the pale glow of my phone screen. Nothing there, no one. The familiar panic of empty space where something should be. But the app shows my passenger count as 1, and the destination field displays an address I've never seen before. 666 Shadowmere Drive. My throat constricts. I've lived in this city my entire life, and Shadowmere Drive doesn't exist. I would know. I pride myself on knowing every street, every shortcut, every dead end. But the GPS is already calculating the route, and that blue line is pulsing again, more urgently now. The whispers in the radio static suddenly clarify, and I nearly wreck my car when I hear them. They're not coming from the speakers. They're coming from directly behind my right ear, so close I can feel non-existent breath on my neck. Turn left on Maple Street. The voice is neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It exists in some uncanny valley between human and something else entirely. My hands grip the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles crack. In the rearview mirror, the back seat remains empty, but I can feel a presence there, a weight that doesn't cast shadows, a passenger who doesn't breathe but somehow takes up space. Continue straight for half a mile. I follow the directions because I don't know what else to do. My body has moved beyond conscious control. Each turn feels inevitable, predestined. The city transforms around me as I drive. Familiar neighborhoods become alien landscapes. Street signs display names I've never heard of. Buildings shift and change when I'm not looking directly at them. morphing into impossible architectures that hurt to perceive. Your destination is ahead on the right. But there is no destination ahead. Just an empty lot between two abandoned warehouses, the kind of place where homeless camps spring up and disappear without explanation. My phone insists this is 6666 Shadowmere Drive, but the address doesn't match anything in reality. The lot is nothing but cracked concrete and weeds pushing through broken asphalt. The invisible presence in my back seat shifts. Though I can't see it, I feel its attention focus on me with laser intensity. The temperature drops another few degrees, and frost begins forming on the inside of my windshield, despite the sealed windows. End ride, the voice whispers, so close now it might be coming from inside my own head. My finger moves toward the phone screen, but I force myself to stop. Something about completing this ride feels final in a way that terrifies me. Like crossing a line I can never uncross. The presence behind me grows more agitated at my hesitation. The car fills with the sound of rustling fabric, though nothing visible moves. The smell of smoke and decay becomes overwhelming. End ride, it insists, and now there's an edge to the voice, something sharp and hungry. Instead, I throw the car into reverse and gun the engine. The tires squeal against the asphalt as I speed backward down the empty street. In my rearview mirror, the lot begins to change. What I thought was empty space fills with the outline of a massive structure. Not quite a house, not quite something else. It flickers in and out of existence like a badly tuned television signal. The presence in my back seat lets out a sound that might be anger, might be disappointment. The radio explodes with static so loud I have to cover my ears while steering one-handed. The whispers multiply, becoming a chorus of voices all speaking different addresses. 892 Nightfall Avenue, 13113 Tombstone Road, 777 Purgatory Lane. Each address burns itself into my memory as if carved there with a hot blade. Streets that don't exist, places that shouldn't be, destinations for passengers who cast no shadows. The voices layer over each other until they become a deafening cacophony that makes my ears ring and my vision blur. I take a sharp right turn, tires screaming, and suddenly I'm back on a street I recognize. The familiar Texaco station appears ahead, its harsh fluorescent lighting like a beacon of sanity. The whispers fade to a murmur, then to silence. My phone screen flickers and returns to normal, showing no active rides, no impossible addresses. But as I pull into the station's parking lot, my hands still shaking uncontrollably, I notice something that makes my blood freeze. In my recent ride history, there's an entry I don't remember. 1847 Elmwood Lane to 666 Shadowmere Drive, completed. 5 stars. Passenger rating, 5 stars. And a tip of $13.33. The money is already in my account. I sit in my car under the fluorescent lights, engine running, heat on full blast, but I can't stop shivering. Every few seconds I glance at the back seat, expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. The leather looks normal, but there's an indentation in the cushion, a subtle depression that suggests weight, presence, occupation. My phone buzzes with a new notification, a message from the ride-sharing app. Thanks for the great service. Your passenger has left you a review. The review contains only one line. He'll be back tomorrow night. When I check the reviewer's profile, there's no photo, no name, just a blank silhouette and an account created exactly 1 hour ago. But somehow, I know with absolute certainty that tomorrow at 2:17 a.m., my phone will buzz again. The address will appear, 1847 Elmwood Lane. And no matter how many times I decline, no matter where I try to hide, eventually I'll accept that ride. Because now I understand the truth that makes my stomach churn and my hands tremble. I'm not just a driver anymore. I'm a ferryman for passengers who exist between worlds, carrying them to destinations that shouldn't exist, collecting fares paid in currency that isn't quite money. And tomorrow night, there will be more addresses whispered in my ear, more impossible streets to navigate, more empty seats that somehow aren't empty at all. The city's arteries pulse differently after midnight, and now I know why. Some destinations can only be reached in the dark, by drivers who've accepted rides they should have declined. The network is bigger than I imagined, deeper than any map can show. I'm part of it now, whether I want to be or not. The only question is how long I can keep driving before I become something that needs to be driven somewhere else entirely. Story 3. The first thing I noticed wasn't the shadow moving. It was the way my pulse hammered against my wrists as I watched it happen. I'd driven 3 hours into the Colorado mountains to escape everything. The divorce papers sitting unsigned on my kitchen table, the empty bottles multiplying in my recycling bin, and the suffocating weight of a life that had somehow crumbled without me noticing. The rental listing promised isolation, and the weathered log cabin delivered exactly that, miles from the nearest neighbor, tucked between towering pines that creaked like old bones in the wind. The first night passed without incident. I'd built a fire more for comfort than warmth, the September air still holding summer's dying breath. The flames danced cheerfully, casting familiar shadows across the knotty pine walls. Nothing more threatening than the wavering silhouettes of furniture, and my own form hunched in the leather armchair I'd dragged close to the hearth. But on the second night, something changed. I was nursing my third whiskey, staring into the hypnotic flicker of orange and gold, when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. My shadow, cast long and dark against the far wall, had shifted. Not the subtle movement you'd expect from flickering flames, but a deliberate turn of its head, independent of my own motions. My breath caught in my throat. The amber liquid in my glass trembled, tiny ripples spreading across the surface. I forced myself to look directly at the wall, but my shadow appeared normal now, mimicking my movements with perfect synchronization. The alcohol, I told myself. 3 drinks on an empty stomach, combined with exhaustion and stress. Simple explanation. Yet sleep eluded me that night. I lay rigid in the cabin's narrow bed, hyper-aware of every creak and whisper of wind through the eaves. My heart maintained an irregular rhythm, occasionally skipping beats that left me gasping in the darkness. When I finally dozed near dawn, my dreams were filled with reaching shadows and whispered accusations I couldn't quite understand. The third night brought confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind, or perhaps proof that I was losing it more completely than I'd feared. I'd positioned myself differently this time, angling the chair so I could watch both the fire and the wall where the shadows played. The flames settled into their eternal dance, and gradually I began to see the truth. The shadows weren't just moving independently, they were communicating with each other. My own silhouette turned to face another shadow, one that shouldn't have existed. No object in the room could have cast such a shape. Tall, angular, with arms that seemed to extend far beyond human proportions. As I watched, frozen with a terror that made my hands shake uncontrollably, the 2 shadows appeared to engage in conversation. The whispers started then. At first, they were barely audible beneath the fire's crackling, soft sibilant sounds that could have been wind or settling wood. But gradually they grew clearer, and with horrifying recognition, I began to distinguish words. Words about me. Words about things only I knew. "He never said goodbye properly," came the first clear phrase, spoken in a voice that sounded disturbingly like my own father's. My chest tightened as if someone had wrapped steel cables around my ribs and yanked them tight. 37 years old and still running," whispered another voice, this one carrying the disappointed tone my ex-wife had perfected during our final months together. My palms were slick with sweat now, and the glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the stone hearth. The crash seemed to energize the shadows, and they began to multiply. Where there had been 2, now 4 writhed against the wall, then 6, then too many to count, their forms overlapping and separating in an intricate dance of accusation. "Tell them about the accident," hissed a voice I recognized as my own, but distorted, stripped of warmth and humanity. "Tell them about the choices you made." My breathing became shallow, rapid pants that left me dizzy. The room seemed to spin slowly around me, the shadows expanding beyond the wall to creep across the ceiling and floor. They were everywhere now, and their whispers had become a chorus of everything I'd tried to forget, every mistake I'd buried beneath years of careful self-deception. The 4th night, I didn't light the fire. I huddled in the corner of the main room, clutching a flashlight with batteries that seemed to drain with supernatural speed. But darkness offered no refuge. The shadows existed now, without flame to cast them, writhing across every surface in the pale beam of my failing light. They had grown bolder, more insistent. Now they spoke in full sentences, recounting memories with perfect clarity, moments I was certain I'd never shared with another soul. The time I'd abandoned my college roommate when he'd needed help with his addiction. The day I'd chosen silence instead of defending a colleague who was being falsely accused. The evening I'd driven away from my father's nursing home, knowing it would be the last time I'd see him alive. Too coward to face his disappointment one final time. My body betrayed me completely now. Cold sweat soaked through my shirt despite the room's warmth. My hands trembled so violently I could barely maintain my grip on the flashlight. Every muscle ached from constant tension, and my throat felt raw from hours of fighting back screams. "You can leave," the shadows whispered in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. "But first, you must remember completely. No more hiding, no more running." The fifth night brought the revelation I'd been dreading. I'd given up pretending I could escape whatever force held me here. My car keys were useless. Every attempt to reach the vehicle ended with me somehow back inside the cabin, though I had no memory of turning around. My phone displayed full signal strength but refused to connect calls. Even breaking windows proved futile. By morning, they were always intact again, as if my desperate attempts at escape had been nothing more than hallucinations. So I sat before the fire I'd finally lit again, accepting that the shadows demanded their due. They had grown more defined now, taking shapes I could almost recognize. Fragments of people from my past, assembled from guilt and memory into something that transcended normal human form. The tallest shadow stepped forward, separating itself from the wall to stand three-dimensional in the room's center. It was my father, but wrong somehow. Too thin, too angular. Eyes that held depths of disappointment I'd never had the courage to confront when he was alive. "You never let me tell you I was proud," it said, and the words hit me like physical blows. "You assumed the worst and ran before I could explain." My vision blurred as tears finally came, hot and shameful. The shadow was right. I'd spent so many years anticipating rejection that I'd rejected first, building walls that kept out both pain and love with equal efficiency. Other shadows stepped forward now, each carrying their own burden of truth. My ex-wife's silhouette spoke of the emotional distance I'd maintained even during our best times, how I'd held pieces of myself back as insurance against inevitable hurt. Former friends recounted moments when I'd chosen self-preservation over loyalty, always finding rational justifications for small acts of betrayal. But the worst shadow was the last one, a perfect replica of myself, speaking in my own voice about the person I'd become. It described a man so afraid of vulnerability that he'd constructed an entire existence around avoiding meaningful connection. Someone who'd confused strength with isolation and wisdom with cynicism. "You brought us here," my shadow self explained with terrible gentleness. "Every unexamined regret, every relationship you sabotaged from fear, every opportunity for growth you abandoned. We're not haunting you. You're haunting yourself." The recognition was like a physical blow that left me gasping. My chest felt crushed under the weight of accumulated truth, and for a moment, I thought I might suffocate from the sheer enormity of what I'd been carrying all these years. But then something shifted. The terror that had consumed me for days began to transform into something else. Not relief exactly, but a kind of exhausted acceptance. The shadows were still there, still real, but their whispers no longer felt like attacks. They felt like invitations. "We can't undo the past," the shadow of my father said, his form beginning to waver like smoke. "But you can stop running from it." One by one, the shadows began to fade, their forms dissolving back into ordinary darkness cast by fire and furniture. But their final words lingered in the air around me like a promise and a warning combined. "Remember us," they whispered. "Remember what we've shown you. And for once in your life, stay and face what comes next." When morning came, I was still sitting in the chair, surrounded by the normal shadows of an ordinary cabin. My car started without protest, and the mountain road stretched clear and navigable toward the valley below. I could leave. The shadows had kept their promise, but as I packed my things, I found myself moving slowly, reluctantly. The terror was gone, replaced by something more complex, a deep ache of recognition that would follow me wherever I went. The shadows hadn't lied. They'd shown me exactly who I was, and now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. I drove away from the cabin as the sun reached its zenith, but I carried the darkness with me. Not as a burden this time, but as a reminder. The real haunting, I understood now, wasn't supernatural at all. It was the slow, methodical way we ghost ourselves, one avoided truth at a time, until we become shadows of who we might have been. The divorce papers were still waiting on my kitchen table when I returned home, but for the first time in months, I thought I might be ready to sign them. Not as an act of surrender, but as an acknowledgement of what was real. The shadows had taught me that running from pain didn't eliminate it. It only gave it time to grow stronger in the dark. And somewhere deep in the Colorado mountains, in a cabin that might not even exist when the next desperate soul goes looking for it, shadows still dance against pine walls, waiting patiently for the next person who needs to remember that facing our deepest fears isn't about conquering them. It's about finally becoming honest enough to let them teach us who we really are. Story 4. The dust particles danced in the amber light filtering through the antique shop's grimy windows, each mote suspended like a tiny ghost in the stagnant air. The elderly shopkeeper's fingers trembled as he wrapped the vintage slide projector in yellowed newspaper, his watery eyes avoiding mine with an urgency that should have served as warning enough. I had been browsing through the cluttered aisles of Henderson's Antiquities for over an hour, drawn by nothing in particular, until I spotted the projector tucked behind a collection of tarnished silver frames. The device was a beautiful specimen of 1960s engineering, chrome body gleaming despite decades of neglect, mechanical precision evident in every dial and lever. The price tag read $45, far less than such a piece should command. The shopkeeper muttered something about the previous owner's estate sale as he handed me the wrapped bundle, but his words were lost in the shop's oppressive silence. My palms grew damp against the newspaper as I carried my purchase to the car, though I attributed the sensation to the humid September afternoon, rather than any premonition of what was to come. Back in my apartment, I cleared space on the living room coffee table and unwrapped the projector with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a tomb. The chrome surface was cool against my fingertips, surprisingly pristine, except for a small engraving on the base. Property of Amos Blackwood, 1967. A carousel of slides had been left inside the machine, 24 frames that the previous owner had apparently forgotten to retrieve. My heart rate quickened as I plugged the device into the wall outlet. The fan motor hummed to life with a gentle whir, and the projection bulb cast a perfect rectangle of white light onto the opposite wall. I dimmed the apartment lights and pressed the advance button. The first slide clicked into place with mechanical precision. What I saw defied immediate comprehension. The image showed my own living room, but from an impossible angle, as if the camera had been positioned inside the wall itself, looking out through the plaster and paint. Every detail was perfect. The worn leather armchair where I sat each evening, the stack of unread novels on the side table, even the coffee stain on the carpet that I had never quite managed to remove. But something was fundamentally wrong with the perspective, a disorienting quality that made my stomach lurch and my vision blur at the edges. More disturbing still was the figure I could barely make out in the photograph's periphery, a shadow that seemed to press against the window from outside, its form too indistinct to identify but unmistakably focused on the interior of my apartment. On me. I advanced to the next slide with trembling fingers. This image showed my bedroom, again from that impossible interior vantage point. My bed appeared exactly as I had left it that morning, unmade, with the sheets twisted from a restless night's sleep. But there, in the corner where my dresser should have cast its shadow, stood a figure. Not solid, not entirely there, but present enough to make my breathing shallow and rapid. The shape was tall, unnaturally thin, and seemed to be watching the bed with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The third slide revealed my kitchen, and now the pattern was undeniable. Each photograph captured a room in my apartment with that same impossible perspective, as if the walls had become transparent to some otherworldly observer. And in each image, the shadows grew more pronounced, more clearly defined. They were no longer confined to the periphery, but had moved closer to the center of each frame, closer to where I would be when I occupied these spaces. My mouth went dry as I realized what I was seeing. These weren't photographs of my apartment as it existed now. They were images of my apartment as it would exist. Tomorrow, next week, sometime in the near future. The stack of books on my coffee table was different, arranged in an order I had never used. The coffee stain on the carpet had been joined by another, smaller mark near the window. These were glimpses into my own immediate future, captured somehow by this antique device. But why were the shadows there? What were they waiting for? I clicked through more slides, my pulse hammering against my temples. Each image showed the same rooms from the same impossible angles, but the shadows grew progressively darker, more substantial. In one photograph of my bathroom, a figure stood directly behind where I would be while brushing my teeth, close enough that I should have been able to feel its presence. The image was so clear that I could make out individual fingers pressed against the mirror's surface, leaving no reflection. The 14th slide made me gasp audibly. It showed me sleeping in my bed, photographed from above as if the ceiling had become transparent. I was lying on my side, one arm thrown across the pillow, completely vulnerable. But surrounding the bed, arranged in a perfect circle, stood 7 distinct figures. Each was tall, thin, and impossibly dark, their forms more solid than in the previous images. They were watching me sleep with impatience that felt malevolent, predatory. I scrambled backward from the projector, my chair clattering to the floor. The image remained on the wall, taunting me with its impossible reality. These things, whatever they were, had been in my bedroom while I slept, or would be. The timeline was becoming increasingly unclear, reality and prophecy blending into something that made my rational mind rebel. The apartment suddenly felt different around me. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner more threatening. The familiar sounds of my neighbors moving about their daily routines became sinister whispers. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, my neck muscles tight with strain. I forced myself to continue viewing the slides, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name. The remaining images showed scenes of increasing intimacy and violation. The figures were no longer content to observe from a distance. They had moved closer, sometimes appearing to touch objects in my apartment, leaving no trace but somehow altering the very atmosphere of each room. The final slide stopped my heart entirely. It showed me sitting exactly where I was now, in front of the projector, viewing the slides. But in the photograph, I was not alone. Behind me stood the tallest of the figures, its impossibly long fingers resting on my shoulders. Its face, if it could be called a face, was positioned directly next to my ear, as if whispering secrets that my conscious mind could not yet hear. I spun around so quickly that pain shot through my neck. The space behind my chair was empty, but the air felt charged, electric, as if something had just departed. The temperature in the room had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. That's when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from the window behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tensed for flight. The window looked out onto the fire escape, 3 stories above the alley. Nothing should have been able to reach it from outside. But there, pressed against the glass, were the unmistakable impressions of fingertips. Long, thin impressions that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy. The scratching came again, more insistent now. Not the random scraping of tree branches against glass, but a deliberate pattern, almost like Morse code. As I watched, paralyzed by terror, more fingerprints appeared on the window, then more, until the entire surface of the glass was covered with the impressions of countless hands, all pressing inward, all trying to gain entry. I stumbled toward the projector, desperate to turn it off, to break whatever connection it had established between my reality and this nightmare vision of the future. But as I reached for the power switch, the machine clicked forward to a new slide, one that hadn't been in the carousel before. This image showed my apartment building from the outside, photographed at night. Every window was dark except for mine, which glowed with an unnatural light. But surrounding the building, filling the entire street, stood hundreds of the tall, thin figures. They stretched as far as the photograph's frame could capture, a sea of shadow beings all focused on my single illuminated window. The scratching at my window had become a constant sound now, joined by similar scratching from every window in the apartment. I could hear it coming from the bedroom, the kitchen, even the bathroom. They were everywhere, trying to get in, and somehow the projector had opened a doorway between their realm and mine. My hands shook as I grabbed the plug and yanked it from the wall. The projector's fan motor died with a mechanical sigh, plunging the apartment into sudden darkness. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more frantic. In the darkness, I could hear other sounds, footsteps on the fire escape, voices whispering in a language I couldn't understand, the soft thud of bodies pressing against my door. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers slipping on the wall. When the lights finally came on, the apartment looked exactly as it always had. The windows were clear, unmarked by fingerprints. The sounds had stopped. Everything was normal, mundane, safe, but I knew better now. I had seen the future, and the future was waiting for me. I spent the rest of that night sitting in my armchair, all the lights on, watching every shadow for signs of movement. As dawn approached, exhaustion finally overcame terror, and I dozed fitfully. When I woke, the projector was gone. I searched every inch of the apartment, but it had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Only the slight depression in the carpet where it had sat provided any evidence of its presence. That, and the knowledge of what was coming. Because now I understand the truth. The projector hadn't shown me possible futures. It had shown me inevitable ones. The shadows I had seen were already here, had always been here, waiting for the right moment to step fully into my reality. The machine had simply allowed me to see them before they chose to reveal themselves. And tonight, as I sit in the same chair, I can feel them gathering outside my windows once again. The air grows cold, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the glass, patient fingers begin their scratching. They know I've seen them now. They know I'm aware. The waiting is almost over. Story 5. The Grandview Hotel stood like a rotting tooth against the storm-bruised sky, its Victorian facade crumbling into the mountain mist that seemed to cling to it with desperate fingers. Something was fundamentally wrong with the building's proportions. Windows that didn't align, corners that bent at impossible angles, shadows that fell in directions that defied the weak afternoon sun. I should have turned around right then. The GPS had died 3 hours earlier, leaving me stranded on winding mountain roads that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. When the Grandview's neon sign flickered through the fog like a dying beacon, I felt nothing but relief. The exhaustion of 12 hours behind the wheel had settled into my bones, making even this architectural nightmare appear welcoming. The lobby reeked of mothballs and something else, something organic and sweet that made my stomach clench. Behind the reception desk sat a woman whose age seemed to shift depending on the angle of the flickering overhead lights. Sometimes she appeared middle-aged with graying hair, other times ancient with skin like parchment stretched too thin. She handed me a brass key attached to a heavy wooden fob marked 237 and mentioned that dinner service had ended hours ago. Her voice carried a strange quality, as if it were coming from much farther away than her position behind the desk suggested. The elevator lurched and groaned its way to the second floor, each floor number lighting up with an audible pop that made my teeth ache. The hallway stretched impossibly long in both directions, lined with burgundy carpet so worn that the pattern had faded into abstract stains. Sconces flickered along the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their light sources. Room 237 sat at the end of the left corridor, though I could have sworn I'd seen the same number on a door to my right moments earlier. The key turned with surprising ease, and I stumbled into a space that felt simultaneously too large and suffocatingly small. The bed dominated the center of the room, its floral comforter faded to the color of dried blood. A single window looked out onto nothing but impenetrable darkness, despite the fact that I was only on the second floor. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by sounds that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves, a rhythmic tapping like fingernails on wood, the distant sound of footsteps in rooms that should have been empty, and underneath it all, a low humming that made my skin crawl. I woke at 3:17 a.m. to the sound of my door opening. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lay perfectly still, every muscle tensed. The door had definitely opened. I could feel the change in air pressure, smell the musty corridor seeping into my room. But no one entered. The door simply stood ajar, revealing a slice of hallway that looked nothing like the corridor I'd walked down hours earlier. This hallway was narrower, the carpet a different pattern entirely, and the sconces burned with a bluish light that hurt to look at directly. Sweat began to bead on my forehead despite the room's chill. I forced myself to sit up, my joints protesting with sharp pops that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. When I reached the door and peered out, the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. The numbers on the visible doors were wrong: 315, 408, 172, scattered without any apparent logic. The air tasted metallic, like copper pennies pressed to my tongue. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet immediately reacting to the carpet's unnatural coldness. Behind me, my door swung shut with a soft click. When I turned back, the brass numbers had changed from 237 to 891. My breathing became shallow, rapid. This couldn't be happening. Hotels didn't rearrange themselves. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Exhaustion, stress, maybe some kind of breakdown brought on by months of working 80-hour weeks. But my body knew the truth before my brain could accept it. Every primitive instinct screamed that I was in immediate danger. I tried the handle of room 891, locked. The brass was so cold it nearly stuck to my palm, leaving behind the faint impression of my fingerprints in what looked like frost. I moved to the next door, 624, and found it similarly secured. The numbers seemed to shift and blur as I stared at them, never quite changing while I watched, but somehow different each time I looked away and back. At the end of the hallway, I discovered a heavy fire door marked stairs. My relief was short-lived. Beyond the door lay not a stairwell, but another corridor, this one lined with doors that stood slightly ajar. Through each opening, I could see into rooms that defied the building's external dimensions. One room contained nothing but mirrors reflecting into infinity. Another held furniture covered in white sheets that moved with no apparent breeze. In a third, I glimpsed someone sitting on the edge of a bed, their back turned to me. The figure sat perfectly still, so motionless they might have been carved from stone. I called out, my voice cracking with strain, but received no response. The person didn't even seem to register my presence. When I pushed the door open wider, the hinges screamed like metal tearing, and I could see that the figure was an elderly man in a striped pajama set. His hands rested on his knees with mechanical precision, and his head was tilted at an angle that suggested he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Excuse me," I whispered, but the words seemed to die in the air between us. I approached slowly, my heart beating so hard I was certain he would hear it. When I reached out to touch his shoulder, my hand passed through him as if he were made of smoke and memory. The sensation left my fingers tingling and numb, a coldness that spread up my arm like ice water in my veins. The man suddenly turned his head toward me with a movement so quick and unnatural that I stumbled backward. His eyes were completely white, rolled back to show only the sclera, and his mouth hung open in a perfect circle. He stared directly through me with those horrible blank eyes, and I could swear I heard him whisper something in a language that sounded like wind through dead leaves. I ran. Back in the corridor, I found that the doors had multiplied. Where there had been perhaps a dozen before, now there seemed to be hundreds, stretching into the distance until they became mere dots in my peripheral vision. Each door bore a different number, and some had symbols I didn't recognize. Geometric shapes that hurt to look at directly. Characters that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing on them. Behind many of the partially open doors, I could see more figures. A woman brushing her hair with long mechanical strokes. A man reading a newspaper that never turned its pages. Two people sitting at a small table, their heads bent over what might have been a chess game, neither moving to make the next play. All of them possessed that same supernatural stillness, as if they were trapped between one moment and the next. My mouth had gone completely dry, and my hands shook so violently I had to clench them into fists to make them stop. The rational part of my mind kept insisting this was a dream, that I would wake up in room 237 with nothing but an unsettling memory. But dreams didn't smell like decay and ozone. Dreams didn't make your skin crawl with the certainty that you were being watched by dozens of unblinking eyes. I tried to trace my path back to my original room, but the corridors had become a maze. Every turn led to another impossible hallway. Every door I recognized led somewhere different than before. The carpet had changed colors, sometimes deep red, sometimes a sickly green, sometimes patterns that made my eyes water. The lighting flickered constantly, creating a strobe effect that made everything appear to move in jerky, unnatural motions. Hours seemed to pass, though my watch had stopped at 3:17. I encountered more of the frozen figures, a cleaning woman pushing a cart that never moved forward, a businessman checking his watch with the same gesture repeated endlessly, a couple embracing in a doorway who never completed their kiss. Each time I tried to interact with them, my hands passed through their forms, like they were projections from some other time and place. The worst part was the growing certainty that they could see me. Though they never moved their heads to track my movement, I could feel their attention like physical weight pressing against my skin. Their eyes, when I could see them, followed me with an awareness that contradicted their frozen states. I began to notice patterns in the chaos. Certain door numbers appeared more frequently. The figure of the woman brushing her hair showed up in multiple rooms, always performing the same gesture at the exact same point. The businessman checking his watch appeared in every seventh or eighth doorway, his arm raised in precisely the same position each time. The hotel was repeating itself, recycling the same elements in different combinations. If I could understand the pattern, maybe I could find a way out. I started paying closer attention to the door numbers, looking for mathematical relationships or sequences. The arrangement seemed random at first, but gradually I began to detect a rhythm. Prime numbers appeared more frequently on doors that led to empty rooms. Multiples of 7 usually contained the frozen figures. Even numbers often led to corridors that doubled back on themselves. My room number, 237, was prime. If the pattern held, I needed to find another prime number that would lead me back to my original location. The search took what felt like hours. My legs ached from walking endless corridors. My throat was raw from the dry air, and my nerves were stretched to the breaking point. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. Every sound, the distant humming, the occasional creak of settling wood, the whisper of air through unseen vents, made me jump. Finally, I found a door marked 239, another prime, just 2 numbers higher than my original room. The brass number gleamed like it had just been polished, and the door stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. I pushed it open carefully, half expecting to find another frozen figure or impossible room. Instead, I discovered a space identical to the room I'd checked into hours earlier. Same faded floral comforter, same tiny window looking out into nothingness, same mustiness that spoke of years of neglect. My suitcase sat on the luggage rack exactly where I'd left it. My clothes were folded precisely as I'd arranged them. Even the position of the lamp on the nightstand matched my memory perfectly. But when I turned to close the door behind me, I saw that it now bore the number 239, not 237. The hotel had let me return, but not to the same room. I was close to where I'd started, but not exactly where I belonged. The realization struck me like ice water. I would never find my original room because it no longer existed in the configuration I remembered. The hotel was constantly shifting, rearranging itself according to rules I could only partially understand. I was trapped not by locked doors or physical barriers, but by the building's refusal to remain consistent with itself. Dawn came eventually, though I wasn't sure if it was the same dawn I would have experienced in my original timeline. The light filtering through the window looked wrong, too pale, too thin, lacking the warmth that should accompany sunrise. When I packed my belongings and headed downstairs, the lobby looked exactly as it had the previous evening, down to the woman behind the desk who might have been the same person, or someone completely different. She smiled as I returned the key, her expression pleasant and utterly normal. When I mentioned the strange experiences of the night, her face remained politely blank, as if I were speaking a language she didn't understand. She assured me that the Grandview was a perfectly ordinary establishment, and that she hoped I'd had a restful stay. I left immediately, driving away without looking back, but I knew with cold certainty that some part of me remained in that shifting maze of corridors. Sometimes in the periphery of my vision, I catch glimpses of doors that shouldn't be there, numbered with impossible combinations. Sometimes I hear that distant humming in the spaces between sounds. The Grandview Hotel still stands on that mountain road, I'm certain of it, waiting for the next exhausted traveler to stumble through its doors and become another frozen figure, trapped between moments, checking their watch for all eternity, or brushing their hair with mechanical precision. I never found room 237 again, but I suspect it's still there, waiting for me to return and complete whatever cycle I interrupted by learning the pattern too well. Some nights, I dream of corridors that stretch into infinity, and I wake with the taste of copper on my tongue, and the certainty that somewhere, in a room that might be numbered 237 or 239 or something else entirely, my suitcase still sits on a luggage rack, waiting for me to finish unpacking. Story 6. The silence at Blackwater Lake wasn't natural. It pressed against my eardrums like water itself, thick and suffocating, broken only by the occasional lap of waves against the rocky shore. Even the insects had gone quiet, as if something had warned them away from this place where the trees leaned too far over the water, and their reflections seemed to move independently of their branches above. I'd come here for solitude, 3 days of camping to clear my head after the divorce papers were signed. The real estate agent had mentioned the lake was remote, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense pine forest for 12 miles. What she hadn't mentioned was how the water looked black even in daylight, or how the surrounding wilderness felt like it was holding its breath. My tent sat 20 feet from the water's edge, positioned to catch the sunrise that never seemed to fully penetrate the perpetual mist hanging over the lake's surface. The first day passed without incident, though I noticed small things, the way my compass needle wavered whenever I held it near the water, how my cell phone battery drained faster than it should have, the fact that I hadn't seen a single bird or heard any wildlife since arriving. By the second night, my nerves were already frayed. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by sounds I couldn't identify. Soft splashing that didn't match the rhythm of natural waves. A low humming that seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath my sleeping bag. Each time I unzipped the tent flap to investigate, I found nothing but darkness and that oppressive silence waiting to swallow any noise I might make. It was on the third night that everything changed. I'd been lying awake for hours, staring at the tent ceiling and trying to convince myself that the weekend had been a mistake, that I should pack up at first light and drive back to civilization. My watch showed 2:47 a.m. when the first light appeared. At first I thought it was my imagination, a faint glow beneath the water, maybe 30 feet from shore. I rubbed my eyes, blinked hard, but the light remained. It pulsed gently, like a heartbeat made visible, casting wavering patterns on the underside of the mist. My heart began hammering against my ribs as I watched more lights join the first. They rose slowly from the depths, scattered points of luminescence that seemed to dance with purpose. The water itself began to emit a subtle phosphorescence, as if something vast was stirring in the blackness below. I found myself unzipping the tent flap, my hands trembling as the cool night air hit my face. The lights were brighter now, closer to the surface. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I crawled out and stood at the water's edge, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The temperature had dropped dramatically. My skin prickled with goosebumps that had nothing to do with the cold. Every instinct screamed at me to retreat to the tent, to pack up and leave immediately. But my feet remained planted on the muddy shore as if roots had grown through my boots. That's when I felt it. A touch on my left hand, gentle as a lover's caress, but cold as winter water. I jerked my arm back, stumbling backward, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible anyway. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing against my skin with an almost physical presence. The whisper came next, so soft I might have imagined it if not for the way it seemed to bypass my ears entirely and speak directly into my mind. The voice was ancient, layered with depths that suggested centuries of patience. It spoke of secrets hidden beneath the water, knowledge that had waited eons for someone worthy to receive it. My mouth went dry as cotton. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill, and my legs began to shake. The voice promised revelation, understanding of mysteries that had plagued humanity since the beginning. All I had to do was follow the lights down into the depths where they burned brightest. I took a step toward the water. The rational part of my mind was screaming warnings, but they seemed distant now, muffled by the hypnotic pull of those lights. The water looked inviting despite its darkness, and I could almost feel its cool embrace around my body. Another step brought me to the very edge of the lake, where tiny waves lapped at my boots. The lights were rising faster now, dozens of them, creating an underwater constellation that pulsed in perfect synchronization. The phosphorescence in the water had spread, creating a pathway that seemed to lead directly down into the abyss. My vision began to blur at the edges, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. But as I prepared to take that final step into the water, something shifted in my peripheral vision. The tree reflections on the lake's surface were moving wrong, twisting and writhing as if the water showed not what was above, but something else entirely. Something that had been waiting. The cold touch returned, this time grasping my wrist with surprising strength. I could feel fingers that weren't there, pulling me toward the water with gentle but insistent pressure. My heart rate spiked to a painful rhythm, and sweat now poured down my face despite the freezing air. That's when I saw them in the reflection. Faces beneath the surface, pale and distorted, their eyes reflecting the strange lights like mirrors. They were watching me with expressions of desperate hunger, mouths moving in silent entreaties. Some looked human, others decidedly did not. All of them reached upward with grasping hands. The whisper intensified, becoming a chorus of voices all speaking in unison, promising me everything I'd ever wanted if I would just trust them, just take that final step and let the water close over my head. They spoke of wonders beyond imagination, of secrets that would make me more than human. My foot was already moving forward when I caught sight of something that shattered the spell completely. Among the reflected faces, I saw my own. But it wasn't my reflection from above. It was me, already beneath the water, already one of them, reaching up with the same desperate hunger in my eyes. My underwater self mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help me. The shock sent adrenaline coursing through my system like ice water. I wrenched my wrist free from the invisible grip and stumbled backward, gasping as if I'd been underwater myself. The lights below pulsed angrily, and the water began to churn with increasing violence. But I was already running. I crashed through the darkness toward my campsite, not caring about the branches that tore at my clothes or the roots that tried to trip me. Behind me, the lake erupted in a sound like thunder, but I didn't look back. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip the tent stakes as I tore down my shelter and threw everything into my car. The engine turned over on the third try, and I gunned it up the dirt road without waiting for the headlights to properly illuminate the path. Tree branches scraped against the windows like grasping fingers, and more than once I swore I saw those pale faces reflected in my mirrors. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway, and even then, my hands continued to tremble for hours afterward. When I finally pulled into a rest stop to catch my breath, I checked my phone for the first time since leaving the lake. The screen was filled with missed calls and texts, all from numbers I didn't recognize. But the messages were all the same: coordinates for Blackwater Lake, and a single line of text repeated over and over. "Come back. We're still waiting." I threw the phone in a dumpster and drove straight to the nearest police station, where I tried to explain what had happened. The officer who took my statement listened politely, made notes about possible drug use or mental health episodes, and suggested I see a doctor. But 3 weeks later, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Blackwater Lake, taken from the exact spot where I'd stood that night. The water was calm and dark, showing nothing unusual, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. In the bottom corner of the photo, barely visible among the reeds at the water's edge, was my tent. Still there, still waiting. And on the back of the photograph, written in handwriting I recognized as my own despite never remembering writing it, was a single sentence. "You can't run from what you've already become." I keep the photograph hidden in my desk drawer now, but I can feel it there even when I'm not looking at it. Sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself researching Blackwater Lake online, looking at satellite images and reading about its geological history. The water there is over 300 feet deep in some places, they say. Deeper than it has any right to be. And sometimes, when I'm standing at my bathroom sink brushing my teeth, I catch myself staring at my reflection in the mirror, wondering if what I see there is really me, or just another version of myself still standing at the water's edge, still trying to decide whether to take that final step into the depths where the lights burn brightest. The worst part is that I'm not entirely sure I made the right choice in walking away, because late at night, when the world is quiet and still, I can still hear them calling. Story 7. The Blackwood Public Library had been condemned for 30 years, yet somehow the electricity still hummed through its walls, casting sickly yellow light through dust-choked air that hadn't been properly circulated since the Carter administration. The building squatted on Elm Street like a wounded animal, its Gothic revival architecture twisted into something malevolent by decades of neglect, and the weight of forgotten stories pressing against its crumbling foundation. I shouldn't have been there. The chain-link fence surrounding the property bore weathered signs warning of structural instability and asbestos contamination. But my research into local folklore had hit a dead end everywhere else. The town's historical society claimed no records existed of the strange disappearances that had plagued the area in the 1800s, and the current librarian seemed genuinely puzzled when I mentioned the old stories my grandmother used to tell about shadows that walked among the living in this forgotten corner of New England. The lock on the side entrance had been broken for years, according to the vagrant who'd pointed me in the right direction after I'd slipped him $20 and a promise not to mention where I'd gotten my information. My hands trembled as I pushed through the heavy wooden door, the hinges screaming in protest like something in mortal agony. Inside, the smell hit me first, a nauseating cocktail of mildew, rotting paper, and something else I couldn't identify, something organic and wrong that made my stomach clench. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through boarded windows, creating an atmosphere so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. My footsteps echoed hollow against warped hardwood floors that creaked ominously with each step, as if the building itself was announcing my presence to whatever might be lurking in the shadows between the towering bookshelves. The local history section occupied the rear corner of the main floor, separated from the rest of the library by a wrought iron gate that hung open at an angle, one hinge completely separated from its mounting. The books here looked different from the others, older, bound in leather that had darkened to the color of dried blood, their spines marked with symbols I didn't recognize alongside faded English text. I'd been searching through the collection for maybe an hour when I first heard it. A sound so soft I initially dismissed it as the building settling or perhaps mice scratching inside the walls. But as I stood perfectly still, holding my breath until my lungs burned, the sound resolved into something that made my skin crawl. Whispers, barely audible, seeming to emanate from somewhere nearby. The murmuring led me to a slim volume tucked between two massive tomes on colonial-era agriculture. Unlike its neighbors, this book bore no title on its spine, just a series of strange markings that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. My hands shook as I pulled it from the shelf, surprised by how warm it felt against my palms, as if it had been sitting in direct sunlight rather than moldering in a forgotten corner of an abandoned building. The whispers grew louder the moment I touched the book, not in my ears but somehow inside my skull, vibrating against the inside of my cranium like insects trying to claw their way out. I flipped it open with trembling fingers, expecting to find the source of the strange sounds, but every page was completely blank. Yellowed parchment unmarked by ink, or even the impression of words. Yet the voices continued, clearer now, telling me things I'd never heard before, but somehow knew to be true. They spoke of Margaret Henley, the seamstress who'd vanished from her shop in 1847, leaving behind only a puddle of black water and the lingering scent of roses in winter. They whispered about Thomas Bradwell, the merchant who'd been found standing in his store 3 days after his disappearance, perfectly preserved, but with his eyes replaced by smooth, polished stones. As the voices filled my head, the air around me began to change. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath, and the dust motes that had been drifting lazily through the stagnant air began to move with purpose, swirling into patterns that resembled human shapes. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was certain it would burst, and cold sweat soaked through my shirt despite the chill. The whispers told me about Eleanor Voss, the baker's wife who'd started talking to empty corners of her kitchen, insisting she was conversing with her long-dead mother. Her husband had found her one morning, standing over her mixing bowl, stirring nothing but air, while carrying on an animated conversation with someone who wasn't there. The townspeople had dismissed it as madness until they began seeing the same woman Eleanor claimed to be speaking with, walking through the streets at twilight, her face a mask of confusion and longing. As the story unfolded in my mind, I felt a presence settle beside me. The sensation was unmistakable. The weight of someone sitting on the reading bench, the subtle shift in air pressure, the feeling of being observed by eyes I couldn't see. When I turned my head, expecting to find nothing, I instead saw her, a middle-aged woman in a flour-dusted apron, her face gaunt with worry, her mouth moving soundlessly as if she were trying to speak, but couldn't quite remember how. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I stared at the impossible figure beside me. She seemed solid enough, cast a shadow on the floor, even left a slight depression in the wooden bench where she sat. But when I blinked hard and looked again, she remained, turning toward me with eyes that held a terrible awareness of her own unnatural state. The whispers continued, and more shapes began to form in the swirling dust. Margaret Henley materialized near the fiction section, her sewing basket clutched in hands that flickered between flesh and shadow. Thomas Bradwell stood between the poetry shelves, his stone eyes reflecting the weak overhead lights like polished marbles. Each figure bore the unmistakable mark of being trapped between worlds, neither fully alive nor properly dead. I tried to close the book, but my fingers wouldn't obey. It was as if the whispers had severed the connection between my brain and my body, leaving me a passenger in my own flesh while the voices continued their relentless narration. They told me about the plague of disappearances that had swept through the town in the 1850s, how families had simply vanished from their homes, leaving behind only strange symbols carved into door frames and the lingering scent of ozone after lightning strikes. The temperature continued to drop, and now I could see my breath forming thick clouds that hung in the air far longer than they should have. Ice crystals began forming on the metal shelving, and the whispers took on a more urgent tone, as if they were running out of time to tell their stories. The figures around me grew more solid, more present, their desperate eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I understood then what was happening. The book wasn't just telling me about these lost souls. It was using me as an anchor to pull them back into the world of the living. Each story gave them more substance, more reality, binding them to my perception and through it to the physical realm they'd been torn from so long ago. The whispers told me about the source of the disappearances, a ritual gone wrong, performed by a group of occultists who'd thought they could peer beyond the veil of death without consequence. They'd opened a doorway they couldn't close, creating a tear in reality that had swallowed dozens of innocent people before finally sealing itself. But the victims hadn't died. They'd simply been displaced, existing in a liminal space between life and death, waiting for someone to hear their stories and give them form once more. My vision began to blur as the temperature plummeted further. The figures were so solid now they cast clear shadows, and I could hear their footsteps as they moved closer. Eleanor Voss reached out with one translucent hand, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear over the whispers that continued to pour from the blank pages before me. The book felt burning hot against my palms now, as if it were trying to brand itself into my skin. The whispers reached a crescendo, dozens of voices overlapping as they told me about others who had found the book over the years. Researchers and curious locals who had accidentally become conduits for the displaced dead. Each had eventually abandoned the book when the weight of the stories became too much to bear, but not before adding their own voices to the chorus of the lost. I realized with growing horror that I was meant to be the next narrator, the next keeper of their stories. The book would bind me to this place just as it had bound the spirits to the world, trapping me in an endless cycle of telling and retelling their tales to whoever might be unfortunate enough to find the tome after I was gone. But knowledge brought power, and understanding brought choice. With tremendous effort, I focused on the sensation of my own heartbeat, the rhythm of my own breathing, the weight of my own body on the bench. I was alive, real, present in a way these poor souls were not. The book fed on attention, on the act of perceiving and believing the stories it contained. If I could stop listening, stop believing, perhaps I could break the connection. The whispers became screams as I began to pull my consciousness away from their narratives. The figures around me flickered and wavered like candle flames in a strong wind. Eleanor Voss's face contorted with anguish as she reached for me, her form becoming increasingly transparent. With every ounce of will I possessed, I slammed the book shut. The sound echoed through the library like a gunshot, and suddenly the temperature returned to normal. The figures vanished, leaving only settling dust and the lingering scent of roses and ozone. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely maintain my grip on the book. I knew I couldn't leave it here for someone else to find, but I also knew I couldn't destroy it. The whispers had made it clear that the book was the only thing keeping these souls from being lost forever in the void between worlds. Instead, I tucked it inside my jacket and walked out of that cursed library, carrying with me the weight of dozens of unfinished stories and the terrible knowledge that somewhere, in the space between heartbeats, between thoughts, they were still whispering. The book sits on my desk now, unopened but never silent. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I can still hear them calling to me, begging me to tell their stories just one more time. And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to listen. Story 8. The silence in the Whitmore building after 3 a.m. wasn't peaceful. It was predatory, thick and suffocating like something alive waiting to pounce. Every creak of the old bones of this forgotten structure seemed deliberately timed, as if the building itself was breathing in slow, measured gasps. I'd been living here for 6 months now, the sole resident of what was once a prestigious apartment complex in downtown. The city had condemned most of the surrounding blocks, leaving the Whitmore as an isolated monument to urban decay. Cheap rent came with a price, and I was beginning to understand that some costs couldn't be measured in dollars. The first time I noticed the elevator's strange behavior, I convinced myself it was mechanical failure. Old buildings had quirks, pipes that groaned like wounded animals, radiators that clanked out Morse code messages to ghosts, doors that swung open without provocation. But elevators didn't typically descend below the ground floor on their own initiative, especially not to floors that supposedly didn't exist. It started with the faintest hum penetrating through my apartment walls around 3:15 a.m. The elevator was moving, its ancient cables stretching and groaning under weight that shouldn't have been there. I pressed my ear against the wall shared with the elevator shaft, feeling the vibrations travel through the plaster and into my skull. The mechanical whirring continued past what should have been the basement level, descending deeper into the building's foundation with deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. My mouth went dry as sandpaper. The building blueprints I'd reviewed before signing the lease showed only 5 floors above ground and 1 basement level for utilities. Yet the elevator continued its impossible journey downward, the mechanical sounds growing more distant but never stopping. Sleep became elusive after that first incident. Every night my body would tense at 3 a.m., muscles coiled like piano wire, waiting for that familiar hum. It came without fail, a ritual as precise as clockwork. The elevator would begin its descent, bypassing the lobby, passing through the basement, and continuing into depths that architectural impossibility declared shouldn't exist. By the third week, curiosity began wrestling with self-preservation instincts. I found myself standing in the hallway at 2:50 a.m., positioned where I could see the elevator's floor indicator. The brass arrow pointed to 1 as it should, but when the machinery started its nightly journey, the arrow didn't move. It remained fixed on the first floor, while unmistakably, the elevator car descended far below. My heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the building's perpetual chill. Something fundamental about reality was malfunctioning here, and I was the only witness to its breakdown. The logical part of my mind offered rational explanations. Perhaps the elevator was counterbalanced incorrectly, creating phantom movements. Maybe old recording equipment somewhere was playing back sounds from decades past. But logic felt increasingly fragile in the face of the Whitmore's nocturnal impossibilities. On a Thursday night in my 4th week of residence, I made the decision that would change everything. As the elevator began its descent, I pressed the call button. The machinery paused, hanging suspended between floors like a held breath. Then, impossibly, the doors opened. The elevator car looked normal. Brass fixtures tarnished with age, mahogany panels worn smooth by countless hands, the familiar musty smell of old buildings. But when I stepped inside and examined the button panel, there were additional floors marked below the basement. B2, B3, B4, B5, extending downward in neat numerical sequence to B9. My finger trembled as I pressed B2. The doors closed with finality that sounded like a tomb ceiling, and the car began its descent. The sensation was wrong from the start. Instead of the familiar lurching drop of normal elevator operation, this felt like sinking through thick liquid, each floor boundary marked by a subtle change in air pressure that made my ears pop. The doors opened onto a hallway that couldn't exist, where the basement level contained storage rooms and building utilities. This floor stretched into corridors that seemed to extend beyond the building's footprint. Fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting stuttering shadows that moved independently of their sources. The air tasted metallic, like blood mixed with ozone after lightning strikes. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing with hollow resonance. The walls were painted institutional green, the kind of color designed to be forgettable, but instead became menacing in the uncertain light. Door after door lined both sides of the corridor, each marked with numbers that followed no logical sequence. 7A, 23, 156B, 4. Behind one of these doors, I heard the first voice. It was barely audible, a whisper that might have been wind through cracks in the foundation, but the words were unmistakably human. Someone was pleading to be released, their voice carrying the weight of years or decades of confinement. I pressed my ear to the door, my skin crawling with the sensation of being watched by unseen eyes. The voice spoke of imprisonment between worlds, of being trapped in spaces that existed only in the building's memory. It described wandering these impossible corridors for years, unable to find exits that led anywhere but deeper into the labyrinth. More voices joined the first, a chorus of whispered desperation seeping through the walls themselves. They spoke of being visitors who had taken the elevator at 3 a.m., of being residents who had investigated the building's anomalies, of being workers who had disappeared during construction decades ago. All trapped in this space between floors, between what was real and what the building imagined itself to be. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps that echoed too loudly in the corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered more rapidly, and in the moments of darkness between the flashes, I glimpsed figures moving in my peripheral vision, translucent shapes that seemed constructed from shadow and regret, reaching out with gestures that suggested desperate hope. When I turned to face them directly, they became almost invisible, present only as distortions in the air like heat mirages. But their voices remained clear, overlapping pleas for assistance. for someone to break whatever force held them in this architectural purgatory. I reached for the elevator, but the car had vanished. The shaft yawned empty, cables hanging slack like dead serpents. The whispers grew more insistent, more numerous, until they formed a symphony of trapped souls begging for liberation from their impossible prison. Panic flooded my system with adrenaline that made my hands shake uncontrollably. I ran down the corridor, looking for stairs, for any exit that would lead back to the world I understood. But every door I tried opened onto more corridors, more impossible spaces that defied the building's physical constraints. The Whitmore building had become larger inside than outside, expanded by forces that rendered geometry meaningless. Hours seemed to pass in that maze of whispered pleas and flickering lights. My shirt was soaked with cold sweat, my mouth dessert dry, my legs weak with terror-induced exhaustion. Just when claustrophobia threatened to crush my sanity entirely, I found a stairwell. The stairs led upward, each step marked with letters instead of numbers. B8, B7, B6. I climbed with desperate energy, taking the steps two at a time, driven by primal need to escape the depths where the building stored its secrets. I emerged into the familiar basement level, blessed normal space with its concrete walls and utilitarian purpose. The elevator waited with doors open, as if it had never moved. I stumbled inside and pressed the button for my floor, my entire body trembling with aftershocks of terror. Back in my apartment, I packed everything that mattered into 2 suitcases. Whatever the Whitmore building had become, whatever forces had transformed it into a prison for lost souls, I wanted no part of continuing to witness its nocturnal transformations. But as I prepared to leave at dawn, I realized the most disturbing truth of all. The lease I had signed wasn't for apartment 4B as I remembered. It was for apartment B4. I had been living on one of the impossible floors all along, trapped in the building's expanded reality without ever realizing it. The question that haunts me now, as I write this from a motel room 50 miles away, is whether I actually escaped the Whitmore building, or whether I simply descended deeper into its infinite architecture of imprisonment. Sometimes in the early hours before dawn, I still hear whispers asking for help to be freed from spaces between worlds. And sometimes I whisper back. Story 9. The asphalt stretched endlessly ahead, swallowed by darkness so complete it seemed to devour my headlights before they could penetrate more than 20 feet into the void. No moon tonight, no stars. Just the hypnotic rhythm of yellow lines disappearing beneath my truck, and the steady hum of the engine that had become my only companion for the past 3 hours. I shouldn't have taken this route. The GPS had offered 3 options to get back to Denver from my brother's funeral in small-town Nebraska, and I'd chosen the longest one, the loneliest one. Maybe I needed the solitude to process what had happened, or maybe I was just avoiding the inevitable return to an empty apartment where his absence would hit me like a physical blow all over again. The rearview mirror caught my attention first. A flicker of movement, barely perceptible, like shadow separating from shadow. My eyes darted up to the rectangular frame, expecting to see nothing but the red glow of my taillights painting the road behind me. Instead, there was something else. A shape, keeping pace with my truck, moving with an unsettling fluidity that made my stomach clench. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer needle climbed from 60 to 70, then 75. The shape in the mirror matched my acceleration perfectly, maintaining its position with impossible precision. My hands began to sweat against the steering wheel, leaving damp prints on the worn leather. When I glanced at the passenger side mirror, my breath caught in my throat. Another figure. This one closer to my truck, running alongside with movements that mimicked my own subtle shifts as I corrected the vehicle's path. When I leaned slightly left, it leaned left. When I straightened, it straightened. The synchronization was so perfect, it felt like watching my own reflection, but stretched and distorted into something fundamentally wrong. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force I could feel it in my throat. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Fatigue hallucinations, grief-induced stress, maybe even carbon monoxide seeping into the cabin. But the figures remained. their presence so tangible I could almost feel them pressing against the glass. I slammed on the brakes. The truck lurched to a stop, gravel crunching under the tires as I pulled onto the narrow shoulder. The sudden silence was deafening after hours of engine noise. I sat there, chest heaving, waiting for my vision to clear, for the logical world to reassert itself. The mirrors showed only empty road. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by embarrassment. I was losing it. The stress of the funeral, the long drive, the isolation. It was all combining to play tricks on my exhausted mind. I reached for the radio, needing any sound to break the oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. Static filled the cabin, harsh and grating. I turned the dial, searching for any station that could penetrate this remote stretch of highway. The needle swept across the band, picking up nothing but white noise and the occasional crackle that sounded almost like whispered voices. Then, clear as if the speaker was sitting beside me, came a voice I recognized. "James, if you're listening to this, I need you to understand something important." My own name, spoken in my brother's voice. The blood drained from my face. My hands trembled as I stared at the radio, its green display showing only static frequency numbers. This wasn't possible. Michael had been dead for 3 days. I'd seen his body in the casket, had watched them lower it into the ground just this morning. The road remembers everything, James. Every person who's traveled it, every thought they carried, every fear they tried to leave behind. The voice continued, tinged with static but unmistakably Michael's. My throat constricted, making it difficult to swallow. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air seeping through the truck's seals. I fumbled for the radio's power button, desperate to shut off the impossible transmission. My finger jabbed at the control, but the voice persisted, growing clearer and more insistent. "You have to keep driving, James. Don't stop again. Don't look in the mirrors. The ones who walk beside the road, they're not meant for the living to see. But once you've seen them..." I yanked my hand away from the radio as if it had burned me. The logical explanations I'd been clinging to crumbled like paper in rain. This wasn't stress or hallucinations or carbon monoxide poisoning. Something was fundamentally wrong with this stretch of highway, something that defied every natural law I'd spent 34 years accepting as absolute truth. The engine was still running. I could feel the vibration through the pedals, hear the low rumble that meant escape was still possible. But as I reached for the gear shift, movement in my peripheral vision made me freeze. They were back. Not in the mirrors this time, but standing directly beside the truck. Tall, elongated figures that seemed to be composed of the same darkness that had swallowed the horizon. They stood perfectly still, positioned exactly where they'd been when the truck was moving, as if they'd simply materialized in place when I stopped. My breathing became shallow and rapid. Each inhale felt insufficient, leaving me gasping for air that seemed to have become thinner, less substantial. The figures made no move toward the truck, but their presence radiated a cold that seemed to seep through the metal and glass, settling into my bones like arthritis. One of them turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out features. There were no features to make out, but I felt its attention like a weight pressing against my chest. The certainty that it was looking directly at me, studying me, was so overwhelming that black spots began dancing at the edges of my vision. The radio crackled again, Michael's voice cutting through the static with urgent clarity. "They're echoes, James. Impressions left behind by people who traveled this road when they were changing. People who were between one state of being and another. The road holds on to them, keeps them walking." I forced myself to look away from the figure, to focus on the radio's green glow. Understanding began to dawn, cold and terrible. Michael had driven this same route to visit me 6 months ago, just after his diagnosis. He'd been quiet during that visit, distant, as if part of him was already somewhere else. I didn't know when I drove through here last spring. I was already changing then, already becoming something between living and after. The road caught that moment, kept it, and now I walk with the others who were caught in their own transitions. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel. The figures outside remained motionless, but I could sense their patience, their willingness to wait for as long as necessary. They had all the time in the world. I did not. You have to drive, James. Drive and don't stop, no matter what you see or hear. The road only holds you if you let it. If you keep moving, you'll reach the end before it can trap you, like it trapped us. I slammed the truck into drive and floored the accelerator. Gravel sprayed behind me as the tires fought for traction, then caught, launching the truck back onto the asphalt with a screech of rubber. The figures immediately began running alongside me again, their forms shifting and flowing like liquid shadow. But now there were more of them. Many more. They filled both mirrors, a procession of darkness keeping perfect pace with my increasingly desperate speed. The speedometer hit 80, then 90. The truck shuddered with the strain, but I didn't dare slow down. The radio continued its impossible broadcast, Michael's voice offering fragments of explanation and encouragement that barely penetrated the terror clouding my thoughts. Then I saw what I'd been dreading. Ahead, the road curved sharply to the left, disappearing behind a stand of skeletal trees. But in the distance beyond the curve, I could see lights. Not the warm yellow glow of a town, but the cold blue-white gleam of headlights. My own headlights, cutting through the darkness. I was approaching myself. The realization hit like a physical blow to the chest. The road had looped back on itself, creating a closed circuit that would trap me in an endless repetition. The figures in the mirrors weren't chasing me. They were guiding me, herding me toward this moment of impossible recursion. No, I whispered, the word torn from my throat like a prayer. No, no, no. But even as I spoke, I could see my truck rounding the curve ahead, could see myself behind the wheel, eyes wide with the same terror I felt now. In seconds, I would meet myself on this impossible road, and the loop would be complete. The radio erupted with voices, not just Michael's now, but dozens of others, all speaking at once in a cacophony of warnings and pleas and desperate instructions. Through the chaos, I caught fragments that might have been the key to escape, but the overlapping words blurred together into meaninglessness. The distance between the two trucks closed rapidly. 50 yards, 40, 30. At the last possible moment, I wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right, sending the truck careening off the road and into the field beyond. The vehicle bounced and lurched over rough ground, headlights sweeping wildly across dead grass and scattered stones. Behind me, I caught a glimpse of the other truck, my truck, continuing along the road, its taillights disappearing around the next curve. The engine stalled. In the sudden silence, I sat in the middle of the empty field, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The radio had gone silent. The mirrors showed only darkness. Slowly, afraid of what I might see, I looked back toward the road. It was gone. Where the asphalt should have been, there was only more field, stretching endlessly in all directions. No road, no yellow lines, no figures walking in eternal procession. I tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The dashboard lights flickered once, then died, leaving me in complete darkness. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out shapes in the distance. Not the shadow figures from the road, but something else. Structures, maybe. Buildings. With no other choice, I abandoned the truck and began walking toward what might have been salvation or might have been another trap. Each step across the uneven ground sent vibrations up through my legs, and I realized with growing unease that the earth beneath my feet felt wrong, too soft, too yielding, as if I were walking on something that had once been solid, but was now giving way to entropy. The shapes resolved into the outline of a small town, real buildings with real lights glowing in real windows. As I stumbled into the first street, a sign at the town limits caught my attention. Welcome to Millbrook, population 247. I'd never heard of Millbrook, and it hadn't appeared on any of the maps I'd consulted before taking this route. But it was real, and it was here, and I was alive to see it. The local sheriff found me wandering the main street an hour later, disheveled and babbling about impossible roads and shadow figures. He listened with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with stranded travelers, who'd had their nerves shattered by the isolation of rural highways. My truck, he explained, had been found abandoned on Highway 34, about 50 miles south. There was no field where I claimed to have crashed, no mysterious road that looped back on itself. But when I asked him about the radio transmission, about hearing my dead brother's voice, something shifted in his expression. He looked at me for a long moment, then mentioned that there had been other reports over the years. Travelers on certain stretches of highway, claiming to hear voices of people they'd lost, seeing figures that matched their movements in mirrors and windows. He drove me to my truck himself, following a route that took us along highways I recognized, past landmarks that made sense. When we reached the vehicle, it started immediately, showing no signs of the mechanical failure that had stranded me in the field. I never found that road again, though I've looked. The official route I'd taken was well documented, appearing on every map and GPS system I consulted. There were no deviations, no alternate paths that could have led me to that impossible stretch of asphalt where the dead walked alongside the living. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I catch movement in my peripheral vision. A flicker in the rearview mirror, a shadow that seems to match my movements a little too perfectly. And when I tune the radio to frequencies that should only carry static, I sometimes hear voices. Not just Michael's, but others who found themselves caught between one state of being and another, their impressions burned into highways that remember everything. I drive faster now when I see those shadows, and I never, ever stop until I reach my destination, because I learned something on that impossible road, something that chills me to think about. The boundary between the living and the dead isn't as solid as we pretend it is, and there are places where that boundary wears thin, where the echoes of transition linger like stains that can never be completely washed away. The road remembers everything, and sometimes, if you're unlucky enough to travel it at the wrong moment, in the wrong state of mind, it remembers you too. Story 10. The silence in the Meridian Contemporary Gallery after closing hours wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. It crept through the polished concrete floors and climbed the stark white walls like something alive, something waiting. The LED spotlights cast harsh pools of clinical light that left everything else drowning in shadow, creating a checkerboard of visibility that made every corner a potential hiding place. I'd been working nights at the gallery for 3 months, and the job had seemed like a blessing at first. Good pay, quiet environment, and plenty of time to read between my hourly rounds. The gallery specialized in contemporary pieces, abstract paintings, conceptual installations, and the kind of art that made visitors scratch their heads and wonder if their 5-year-old could do better. Nothing that should have kept me awake during my downtime. Nothing that should have made my skin crawl every time I walked past certain pieces. But it started small, like all the worst things do. During my second week, I noticed something odd about one of the paintings in the East Wing. A large canvas dominated by swirling blues and grays that the placard identified as Urban Solitude No. 7, by an artist I'd never heard of. The painting showed what looked like a subway platform, though the brushstrokes were loose enough that it could have been interpreted as almost anything. What caught my attention wasn't the technique or the color palette, but the fact that I could swear there was a figure standing on the platform that I hadn't noticed before. I stood there for a full 5 minutes during my 2 a.m. round, staring at the canvas under the harsh spotlight. The figure was barely more than a suggestion, a darker smudge against the platform that could have been a person waiting for a train. My eyes burned from staring, and I told myself it was just the way shadows played across the textured paint. Artists were clever about creating optical illusions, making viewers see things that weren't really there. The next night, the figure was clearer. My heart rate spiked as I approached the painting, flashlight beam dancing across the wall beside it. The figure on the platform was definitely human-shaped now, still rendered in the same loose, impressionistic style as the rest of the piece, but unmistakably a person. A man, from the look of the silhouette. He seemed to be facing away from the viewer, looking down the tunnel as if waiting for something that would never come. I pulled out my phone and took a picture, then immediately felt foolish. What was I going to do? Compare it to photos from the gallery's website? Report to my supervisor that I thought a painting was changing? I'd be out of a job and probably recommended for psychiatric evaluation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The gallery felt different after that. The silence became oppressive, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own pulse hammering in my head. Every creak of the building settling, every hum from the climate control system, every distant sound from the street outside made me pause mid-step and listen. My rounds became exercises in controlled terror. Each turn of a corner a potential confrontation with something I couldn't name. By the end of the week, 3 more paintings had developed similar figures. Morning Commute in the North Gallery now showed a shadowy person standing at a bus stop, barely visible through what the artist had painted as rain-streaked glass. Neighborhood Watch featured someone standing behind a window in one of the suburban houses, just a dark shape that could have been a person, or a curtain, or a trick of light. Coffee Shop Chronicles had gained a customer sitting alone at a corner table, face obscured by the strategic placement of a hanging plant. The worst part wasn't just that the figures were appearing, it was that they all seemed to be watching something. Their posture, even rendered in abstract brushstrokes and suggested forms, conveyed a sense of focused attention. They were observers, and whatever they were observing was always just outside the frame of each painting. My hands started shaking during my rounds. I'd grip my flashlight so tightly that my knuckles went white, and I'd find myself holding my breath as I approached each new piece. The building's heating system would kick on with a metallic groan, and I'd nearly jump out of my skin. My mouth went dry every time I entered a new gallery space, and I started carrying a water bottle to combat the constant thirst that came with my elevated stress levels. During my lunch break one night, I decided to research the gallery's history. The building itself was relatively new, constructed 15 years ago specifically to house the Meridian Contemporary. But the land had an interesting past. It had been the site of a much older art studio, one that had belonged to a painter named Marcus Thorne, who had died in the late 1980s. The records were sparse, but I found mentions of Thorne's work being psychologically disturbing and uncomfortably voyeuristic. The connection felt thin, almost ridiculous, but I couldn't let it go. I started paying closer attention to the figures in the paintings, and that's when I noticed the resemblance. Each shadowy observer, when I squinted and tried to make out details in the abstract brushwork, seemed to have similar proportions. Similar height, similar build, similar posture. The figure in Urban Solitude number 7 had the same slightly slouched shoulders as the one in Coffee Shop Chronicles. The person behind the window in Neighborhood Watch stood with the same weight distribution as the bus stop figure in Morning Commute. They weren't just random observers. They were the same observer, repeated across multiple paintings, watching different scenes from different vantage points, and he looked like me. The realization hit me during my 4 a.m. round as I stood in front of Urban Solitude number 7, close enough that my breath fogged the protective glass. The figure on the subway platform had my height, my build, my way of standing with one hip slightly cocked. The hair, rendered in loose brush strokes of dark paint, fell across the forehead in the same way mine did when I forgot to use gel. My breathing became shallow and rapid. The gallery suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in from all sides. I stumbled backward from the painting, my vision tunneling as panic set in. The climate control system hummed louder, or maybe my hearing had become hypersensitive. Every sound seemed amplified. My footsteps on the polished concrete, the rustle of my uniform, the rasp of my increasingly labored breathing. I forced myself to check the other paintings. The figure in Coffee Shop Chronicles had my profile. I was certain of it now. The nose, the jawline, the way the head tilted slightly when focused on something. It was all wrong in the way that funhouse mirrors are wrong, distorted but recognizable. The person behind the window in Neighborhood Watch had my posture, the particular way I stood when I was trying to be inconspicuous. But they weren't looking at nothing anymore. Each figure was now clearly focused on something specific within their painted world, and when I followed their gaze, I saw him. In Urban Solitude number 7, across the subway platform from my doppelganger, another figure waited by the tracks. This one was painted with more detail, more precision, though still within the impressionistic style of the piece. It was a man in a security guard uniform, holding a flashlight, looking lost and confused. He had my face, my actual face, not the shadowy suggestion of it that watched from the other side of the platform, but my features rendered in careful brushstrokes. The artist had captured the slight scar above my left eyebrow, the way my ear stuck out just a little too much, the perpetual 5 o'clock shadow that I could never quite eliminate. I was in the painting. I was being watched by myself. The pattern repeated across every canvas that had developed figures. In Coffee Shop Chronicles, I sat at a table near the window, nursing a cup of coffee and staring at my phone, oblivious to the observer in the corner. In Neighborhood Watch, I was visible through another window, moving around what looked like my own apartment, going about my evening routine while being studied by the figure across the street. The paintings were documenting my life. My legs felt weak, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. The gallery spun around me, the harsh LED lights creating streaks across my vision. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard that I could feel it in my throat, and cold sweat broke out across my forehead and down my back. I tried to rationalize it. Stress hallucinations, sleep deprivation, some kind of psychological break brought on by too many solitary nights in an unsettling environment. But when I looked at the paintings again, the details were still there, still perfect, still impossible. Over the following nights, more paintings began to change. Laundromat Blues developed a figure watching through the window as a man who looked exactly like me, folded clothes at 2 a.m. Gas Station Nocturne showed me pumping gas while a shadowy observer watched from beside the air pump. All Night Diner featured me sitting at the counter, eating a sandwich, while someone in a back booth studied my every move. The watchers were getting bolder, more detailed. They were no longer content to be suggestions in the background. In some paintings, they had moved closer to their observation points. The figure in Urban Solitude number 7 had migrated from the far end of the platform to just a few feet away from my painted self. The observer in Coffee Shop Chronicles had switched tables, now sitting close enough to eavesdrop on conversations. And they were all looking directly out of the paintings now, making eye contact with me as I conducted my rounds. The gallery became a maze of surveillance. Every painting had become a window through which multiple versions of myself watched a man who looked exactly like me live his life in parallel painted worlds. The observers had my face but hollow, dark eyes that tracked my movement through the real gallery. When I walked past morning commute, the watcher at the bus stop would follow me with his gaze until I moved out of his painted line of sight. I stopped sleeping during my breaks. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel them watching, waiting. My hands developed a permanent tremor, and I started dropping things. My flashlight, my keys, my phone. The water bottle I carried was never full for long. My mouth stayed desert dry no matter how much I drank. The building's night sounds became a symphony of terror. The heating system's mechanical groans sounded like whispers. The settling of the structure created footsteps that weren't there. Every distant car engine could have been someone approaching the building. I found myself checking locks obsessively, testing doors that I knew were secure, peering through windows at empty parking lots that felt full of hidden observers. 3 weeks after the first figure appeared, I discovered that the paintings were no longer content to merely observe. During my midnight round, I noticed that Urban Solitude number 7 had changed again. The figure representing me was no longer waiting passively on the subway platform. He was walking toward the edge of the frame, toward the watcher who had been studying him. But more disturbing than that, the painted version of myself was becoming less detailed, less solid. His edges were blurring, his features becoming indistinct. He was fading, and the observer was becoming more real. The watcher now had color in his cheeks, depth in his eyes, texture in his clothing. He was absorbing the reality that was bleeding out of my painted self, becoming more three-dimensional while the man he'd been watching dissolved into abstract brushstrokes. I understood then what was happening. The paintings weren't just documenting my life, they were stealing it. Every night, I became a little less real while my watchers became more substantial. The process was slow, subtle, but undeniable. I caught glimpses of myself in the gallery's mirrors and noticed that my reflection seemed slightly off, as if I were looking at myself through water or frosted glass. My movements felt delayed, disconnected from my intentions. When I spoke to myself, and I'd started doing that a lot, just to hear a human voice in the oppressive silence, my words sounded hollow and distant. The painted observers were patient, methodical. They watched and waited and grew more real while I became their two-dimensional echo. But I wasn't going to let them win. On what I decided would be my last night at the gallery, I came prepared. I'd spent the day researching Marcus Thorne more thoroughly, tracking down articles about his death and his work. He'd been found in his studio, sitting in front of an easel, apparently having died of natural causes while painting. But the painting on the easel had been blank, except for a single brushstroke, a dark line that observers described as looking like the beginning of a human figure. His other paintings, the ones that had been described as psychologically disturbing, had all featured watchers. Figures that seemed to observe the viewer rather than existing within their painted worlds. The art community had dismissed them as clever optical illusions, but several collectors had reported feeling uncomfortable around the pieces, as if they were being studied. Thorne had been trying to paint his way into another reality, and something had been painting its way into his. I entered the gallery that night with a plan. If the painted observers were stealing my reality by watching me, then I needed to stop being worth watching. I needed to become the observer instead of the observed. Starting with Urban Solitude number 7, I positioned myself directly in front of the painting and stared back at the figure who had been watching me for weeks. My heart pounded as I met those hollow, dark eyes, but I forced myself to maintain eye contact. The figure had grown so detailed that I could make out individual brushstrokes in his hair, see the reflection of the painted subway lights in his pupils. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the figure blinked. It was subtle, barely more than a flutter of painted eyelids, but it was real. The observer was acknowledging my attention, recognizing that the dynamic between us had shifted. I moved to the next painting, then the next, staring down each watcher in turn. With every confrontation, they became a little less solid, a little more abstract. The process that had been draining my reality was reversing itself. I was reclaiming my three-dimensional existence by refusing to be their passive subject. But they weren't giving up without a fight. As I worked my way through the gallery, the paintings began to change more rapidly. The observers moved within their frames, stepping closer to the edges, reaching toward the boundaries that separated their painted world from mine. Their eyes grew more desperate, more hungry. In Coffee Shop Chronicles, the watcher stood up from his table and pressed his face against what would have been the window separating us, his features distorting against the invisible barrier. The gallery filled with sounds that had no source, whispers in languages I didn't recognize, footsteps that echoed from empty rooms, the scratch of brushes against canvas coming from walls where no painting was being created. The temperature dropped until my breath fogged in the air, and the LED lights began to flicker in patterns that hurt to look at. In Urban Solitude number 7, my painted self was almost completely gone now, just a faint smudge on the subway platform. But the observer was fighting to maintain his reality, his stolen substance. He'd moved to the very edge of the frame and was reaching out with one hand, trying to bridge the gap between the painted world and the real one. I could feel the pull, the temptation to reach back, to make contact. Part of me wanted to let him win, to slip into the comfortable two-dimensional existence, where I wouldn't have to deal with bills or loneliness, or the crushing weight of three-dimensional reality. The painted world promised simplicity, permanence, a life without the constant anxiety that had plagued me even before I'd started working at the gallery. But I knew what that life would cost. Instead of reaching toward the painting, I stepped back, and then back again. I put distance between myself and every canvas, breaking the visual connection that the observers depended on. Without my direct attention, they began to fade, becoming abstract suggestions once more. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I kept moving, kept denying them the focused attention they needed to maintain their stolen reality. The gallery's lights stopped flickering and returned to their harsh, steady illumination. The temperature rose back to normal. The phantom sounds faded until only the familiar hum of the climate control system remained. By dawn, the paintings had returned to their original states. Abstract compositions without hidden figures, without watchers, without any suggestion of life beyond the boundaries of their frames. I submitted my resignation that morning, citing personal reasons. The day supervisor seemed unsurprised. Apparently, the gallery had a high turnover rate for night security positions. She mentioned that they'd had trouble keeping people in the job for more than a few months, though she didn't elaborate on why. I never went back to see if the paintings had changed again, if new watchers had emerged to study whoever replaced me. But sometimes, when I catch my reflection in unexpected places, store windows, car mirrors, the black screen of my phone, I notice that I cast a slightly richer shadow than I used to, as if I'd reclaimed not just my own reality, but absorbed a little extra substance from the painted world. The experience left me changed in other ways too. I find myself more aware of being observed, more conscious of the boundary between watching and being watched. In crowded places, I sometimes feel the familiar crawling sensation of eyes on me, but when I turn to look, I never see anyone paying particular attention. The feeling passes quickly, but it's a reminder that the line between observer and observed is thinner than most people realize. And late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I sometimes wonder if there are other places like the Meridian Contemporary Gallery, other buildings where the boundary between reality and representation has worn thin. I wonder if there are other night security guards standing in front of paintings, trying to decide whether to reach toward the figures reaching back at them. I hope they make the right choice. But I also know that the painted world is always watching, always waiting, always ready to offer its seductive simplicity to anyone tired enough, or lonely enough, or desperate enough to accept the trade. The gallery may have lost its hold on me, but I learned something about the nature of observation that I'll never be able to forget. We're all being watched, all the time, by versions of ourselves that exist in parallel realities just beyond our perception. The only question is whether we'll remain the watchers or allow ourselves to become the watched. I chose to keep my 3 dimensions, but the choice cost me my peace of mind. Now I know that somewhere, in painted worlds that exist in the spaces between brushstrokes, there are observers who remember what it felt like to be real, and they're still looking for a way back. Story 11. The inheritance letter arrived on a Tuesday that reeked of decay, as if the very paper had absorbed the rot of whatever secrets it carried. Great-Uncle Ezra's farm waited for me in the countryside, a place I'd heard whispered about in hushed family conversations that always ended abruptly when I entered the room. The gravel driveway crunched beneath my tires like grinding teeth, each stone seeming to protest my arrival. Twisted oak trees formed a gauntlet along the path, their gnarled branches reaching toward my windshield with skeletal fingers. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its weathered clapboard siding stained dark with moisture and time. Paint peeled from its walls like diseased skin, and several windows stared back at me with the hollow emptiness of dead eyes. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, my hands still gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton soaked in blood. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath in this place. The barn stood behind the house, a massive structure that had once been red but now appeared the color of dried blood in the fading afternoon light. Ancient lanterns hung from its eaves like hanged men, their glass globes clouded with decades of grime and spiderwebs. Some swayed slightly despite the still air, creating shadows that danced across the barn's weathered boards in patterns that hurt to watch too closely. My footsteps echoed hollowly on the farmhouse porch. The floorboards sagged under my weight, groaning with the voice of old wood that had absorbed too many secrets. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the house were eager to swallow me whole. Inside, dust motes floated in the amber light filtering through grimy windows, and the air tasted of mildew and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my throat constrict. Sheets covered the furniture like burial shrouds, and family photographs lined the mantelpiece, their subjects staring out from behind cracked glass with expressions that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I recognized my grandfather as a young man, standing next to a woman whose face had been deliberately scratched out with something sharp. The gouges in the glass caught the light like tiny scars. The floorboards upstairs creaked rhythmically, as if someone were pacing back and forth. I told myself it was the house settling, but the sounds came too regularly, too purposefully. My pulse quickened, and I could feel sweat beginning to bead along my hairline despite the cool air. As sunset approached, I found myself drawn to the kitchen window that faced the barn. The lanterns hung motionless in the dying light, their surfaces reflecting the last rays of sun like watching eyes. I counted them, 13 in total, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. My stomach clenched as I realized they formed a rough circle, with one hanging alone in the center. The first stars appeared as purple shadows crept across the property. I was making coffee when the peripheral motion caught my attention. One of the lanterns was glowing with a soft, cold light that had nothing to do with electricity. My hands began to tremble, causing the coffee mug to rattle against the counter. The glow spread to another lantern, then another, until all 13 pulsed with that sickly illumination. Then they began to move. The sight defied every rational thought in my mind. The lanterns detached from their hooks with deliberate precision, floating through the air like jellyfish through dark water. They arranged themselves in a line, the lead lantern hovering at head height near the barn door, while the others maintained perfect spacing behind it. The sight made my knees weak, and I gripped the windowsill to keep from falling. The lead lantern began to drift away from the barn, moving with purpose toward a path I hadn't noticed before, a narrow trail that wound between overgrown hedgerows toward the back of the property. The other lanterns followed in single file, their collective glow casting shifting shadows that seemed to writhe with independent life. My rational mind screamed warnings, but something deeper compelled me forward. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, though its beam seemed pitiful compared to the supernatural radiance outside. The screen door slammed behind me with a sound like a gunshot, and the night air hit my face like a cold, dead hand. The floating lanterns waited at the edge of the path, bobbing gently as if breathing. My footsteps crunched on fallen leaves that should have been green in late summer, but were instead brown and brittle, crumbling to powder beneath my shoes. The smell of rot grew stronger with each step, and I could taste it on my tongue, sweet decay mixed with something metallic that made my stomach churn. The lanterns moved forward as I approached, maintaining their distance like trained animals leading their master. The path wound deeper into the property than I had imagined possible, past outbuildings I hadn't seen during my daylight exploration. A chicken coop stood empty, its wire mesh torn and hanging like broken skin. A well sat uncovered, its depths so black they seemed to swallow the lantern light that passed overhead. My breathing became labored, not from exertion, but from the oppressive weight of the atmosphere. Each breath felt thick and reluctant, as if the very air resisted entering my lungs. Sweat ran down my spine despite the cool night, and my shirt clung to my skin like a second, unwanted layer. The lanterns led me to a clearing where the grass grew in strange patterns, bare patches arranged in symbols that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. At the center stood a stone foundation, all that remained of some long-demolished structure. The lanterns arranged themselves in a circle around the foundation, their light revealing what lay within. Bones. Not human. I could see that much even in my terror-clouded state, but arranged with careful precision. Cow bones, pig bones, sheep bones, all bleached white and positioned in patterns that spoke of ritual and purpose. My throat closed completely, and I fought the urge to vomit. The metallic taste in my mouth intensified until I could barely swallow. The lantern in the center of the circle descended until it hovered just above the bone arrangement. Its light changed, becoming brighter, more intense, and in that harsh illumination, I saw something that made my sanity teeter on a knife's edge. Carved into the foundation stones were names, family names I recognized, including my own grandfather's. But they weren't commemorative carvings. They were accusations. Murderer was carved beneath my grandfather's name. Thief beneath another relative. Betrayer beneath a third. The words seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life, growing darker and more defined as I stared at them. My legs gave out, and I fell to my knees in the diseased grass, my flashlight tumbling from nerveless fingers. The floating lanterns began to move again, but this time they descended toward me. The cold light washed over my skin like ice water, and in that moment I felt the presence of everyone who had died on this property. Not from natural causes, but from the actions of my family members who had used this place as their private slaughterhouse for decades. Not people, but animals. Countless animals killed for profit, for sport, for reasons that made my stomach twist with disgust. The truth crashed over me like a physical blow. Great-uncle Ezra hadn't been a farmer. He'd been something far worse. A man who killed for pleasure and profit, who had trained my grandfather and other family members in his twisted practices. The barn hadn't housed livestock. It had housed death. The sweet smell that permeated the property wasn't decay. It was the lingering essence of countless creatures who had suffered and died in this cursed place. I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the diseased earth as the lanterns pressed closer. The bone arrangements began to shift and move, reassembling themselves into new configurations that hurt to perceive. The names carved in the stone foundation deepened, as if invisible hands were working the chisel even now. The lanterns rose higher, forming a dome of cold light above me. In that trapped space, I heard them, not voices, but something worse. The dying sounds of every creature that had perished on this property, compressed into a single, overwhelming cacophony of suffering. My eardrums felt ready to burst, and blood began to trickle from my nose. I ran. Blind terror gave my legs strength I didn't know I possessed, and I crashed through the overgrown path like a wild animal. Branches tore at my clothes and face, drawing warm blood that I couldn't feel through the numbing horror. Behind me, the lanterns followed at a distance, their light creating a moving aurora of damnation through the trees. The farmhouse appeared ahead like a salvation I didn't deserve. I burst through the screen door and slammed it behind me, though I knew such physical barriers meant nothing to whatever haunted this place. My chest heaved as I gasped for air that still tasted of death and copper. But the lanterns had stopped at the edge of the porch. They hovered there, waiting, their light casting my shadow against the kitchen wall in shapes that didn't match my actual position. I realized with crystalline clarity that they weren't trying to harm me. They were trying to show me something. They wanted me to know what my family had done, what legacy I had inherited along with this cursed property. I spent the night huddled in the kitchen, watching those 13 lights maintain their vigil outside. As dawn approached, they finally began to fade, drifting back toward the barn like tired spirits returning to their rest. But I knew they would return the next night, and every night after, waiting for me to make a choice. The inheritance papers lay scattered on the kitchen table where I had left them the previous evening. With shaking hands, I picked up a pen and signed the deed transfer, not to claim the property, but to donate it to the state with the stipulation that it be turned into a wildlife preserve, a sanctuary for the living, to balance the scales of what had been done to the dead. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one final time. The lanterns hung motionless from the barn eaves, but I could swear I saw something like approval in their clouded glass. The property would never be truly clean, but perhaps the suffering could finally end. The taste of copper stayed in my mouth for weeks afterward, and sometimes, in the depths of night, I still dream of floating lights and bones arranged in patterns that no living thing should ever have to see. Story 12. The silence in my new house felt wrong from the moment I stepped inside. Not the comfortable quiet of an empty home, but something thicker, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. I'd bought the place cheap, a 1920s craftsman that had sat vacant for 3 years after the previous owner simply vanished one winter morning. leaving behind only unpaid bills and neighbors who spoke in hushed tones about strange sounds in the night. The realtor had been eager to close, almost desperate, her hands trembling slightly as she handed over the keys with a smile that never reached her eyes. The first few weeks passed uneventfully as I settled into my new routine, unpacking boxes and trying to ignore the way shadows seemed to linger longer than they should in certain corners of the house. It was while clearing out the detached garage that I found it, a massive Philco radio from the 1940s, its wooden cabinet scarred but intact, sitting forgotten beneath a moth-eaten tarp like some sleeping beast. My fingers traced the dusty dials and brass fittings, admiring the craftsmanship of an era when things were built to last. The previous owner had clearly abandoned it here, probably too heavy and outdated to bother moving. I hauled it inside, surprised by its substantial weight, and positioned it on the mantel in my living room, where its Art Deco lines complemented the house's vintage character. That evening, after connecting it to power, I turned the large tuning dial with the reverence due to such an artifact. Static filled the room, not the sharp digital static of modern electronics, but something warmer, deeper, like distant ocean waves. As I slowly rotated the dial, fragments of sound emerged from the white noise, snippets of swing music, the fading tail end of a baseball game, a weather report that mentioned temperatures I couldn't quite catch. Then I heard the voice. It emerged from the static like a ghost materializing from fog, crisp and clear despite the antiquated equipment. The announcer spoke with the distinctive cadence of 1940s radio, each word precisely enunciated in that formal theatrical style that had vanished decades ago. Incident on Maple Street continues to baffle local authorities. Residents report strange lights emanating from the old Victorian house at number 1247, accompanied by sounds they describe as not of this world. Mrs. Henderson, who lives across the street, claims to have witnessed what appeared to be figures moving behind the curtains, though the house has been empty for months. My blood turned to ice water in my veins. I lived at 1247 Maple Street. This house, my house, was the old Victorian the announcer was describing. My hands shook as I fumbled for the dial, trying to find the station again, but only static remained. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Old recordings somehow bleeding through the airwaves, a prank by tech-savvy neighbors, anything that didn't involve accepting the impossible reality of what I'd just heard. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the settling house made my heart race. Every shadow cast by streetlights through my windows seemed to move with deliberate purpose. When morning came, I convinced myself it had been my imagination, stress from the move manifesting in auditory hallucinations. But the radio called to me. The next evening, I found myself drawn back to the living room, my feet carrying me to the mantel without conscious decision. The Philco sat there innocuously, its wooden surface gleaming in the lamplight, dials waiting to be turned. My pulse quickened as I reached for the tuning knob, a mixture of dread and desperate curiosity driving my actions. This time I found the station immediately. The same announcer's voice emerged from the speaker, as clear as if he were standing in my living room. Third night running that neighbors have reported disturbances at the Victorian residence. Police Chief Morrison conducted a thorough investigation of the property this afternoon, but found no signs of forced entry or vandalism. However, officers noted an unusual coldness in certain rooms, with temperatures dropping as much as 20 degrees below the rest of the house. Of particular concern is the basement, where investigators discovered what appeared to be ritualistic markings carved into the foundation stones. The basement. I'd avoided it since moving in, telling myself I didn't need the extra storage space. But the announcer's words sent tendrils of ice through my chest. I'd never been down there, never even opened the door. How could a radio broadcast from 70 years ago be describing markings I'd never seen? My hand moved to the basement door key in my pocket, fingers wrapping around the cold metal. The broadcast continued, describing my house in disturbing detail, the way shadows collected in the northeast corner of the living room, where I now sat. The manner in which the floorboards creaked in a specific pattern near the staircase, which they did. The peculiar smell of sulfur that occasionally wafted up from below, which I'd attributed to old plumbing. Mrs. Chen, the previous tenant, was questioned extensively about her sudden departure. She refused to provide details but was observed to tremble visibly when asked about her final night in the residence. Something was coming through, she reportedly told investigators before requesting they not contact her again. The house has remained vacant since, though neighbors continue to report anomalous activity. The broadcast cut to static, leaving me alone with the thunderous sound of my own heartbeat. Mrs. Chen, that was the name on some of the old mail I'd found. The woman who'd lived here before me, who'd simply disappeared one day. Not the immediate previous owner the realtor had mentioned, but someone from even further back. Sweat beaded on my forehead as I tried to process the implications. These broadcasts weren't just describing my house. They were describing its history, events that had apparently been occurring for decades. And each transmission seemed to suggest that whatever had driven out previous residents was still here, still active. Over the following nights, I became obsessed with the radio. Each evening, I'd tune in to hear more fragments of the house's dark past. The broadcasts came from different time periods, some from the 1940s, others from the 1960s, a few that seemed more recent based on terminology and references. All described supernatural incidents at 1247 Maple Street, painting a picture of a residence that had been plagued by otherworldly phenomena for generations. I learned about the Hamilton family who'd fled in 1952 after their young son claimed to see shadow people in his bedroom. The Rodriguezes who'd lasted only 6 months in 1968 before strange sounds in the walls drove them away. The Kowalskis who'd reported furniture moving on its own in 1981. Each broadcast detailed another family's terror, another group of people who'd been forced to abandon their home to whatever lurked within these walls. But the most disturbing revelation came during a transmission from what seemed to be the 1990s. The announcer described a tenant who'd discovered an old radio in the garage, who'd become obsessed with mysterious broadcasts that seemed to describe his own house. The man had apparently documented his experiences, leaving behind journals filled with increasingly frantic entries about voices from the past, warning him of something approaching through time itself. The parallel was unmistakable. I was following the same path as this previous tenant, drawn into the same obsession, experiencing the same phenomena. The realization left me gasping, my chest tight with panic as I understood that I wasn't the first person to find this radio, wasn't the first to hear these broadcasts. I was just the latest in a long line of victims, trapped in a cycle that had been repeating for decades. My hands trembled as I reached for the radio's power switch, desperate to break the connection, but before I could touch it, the announcer's voice changed. The professional, distant tone became urgent, personal, as if he were speaking directly to me. The barriers are thinning. Each broadcast brings them closer. The listener becomes the gateway, the observer becomes the observed. He hears us now, just as they heard us before him. The cycle completes itself when the shadows cross over, when the past bleeds through entirely. The markings in the basement are the key. They've been waiting for someone to activate them, someone to listen long enough for the connection to stabilize. Terror flooded through me, every nerve ending screaming danger. The basement key felt like it was burning in my pocket, and I could swear I heard sounds from below, not the settling of an old house, but deliberate movement, as if something had been waiting down there in the darkness. I stumbled away from the radio, but it continued broadcasting even though I hadn't touched the controls. The announcer's voice followed me as I backed toward the stairs, describing in real time what I was doing, what I was feeling, as if the barrier between past and present had finally dissolved completely. He's moving away from the radio now, but he can't escape what he's already set in motion. The broadcasts have done their work, opened the pathway between then and now. The shadows are ascending from the basement, drawn by decades of accumulated fear and the psychic energy of all who listened before him. The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs as an otherworldly coldness settled over everything. The shadows in the corners began to move independently of any light source, stretching and writhing like living things. Behind me, I could hear the unmistakable sound of the basement door opening, though I hadn't unlocked it. Footsteps, or something approximating footsteps, began climbing the basement stairs. Not the sound of shoes on wood, but something heavier, more deliberate, each impact reverberating through the house's structure. The radio continued its narration, describing each terrifying moment as it unfolded. I ran. My legs carried me out of the house and into the cold night air, leaving behind the radio, my belongings, everything I'd worked to build in this cursed place. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, didn't stop driving until I was miles away, checking my rearview mirror obsessively to ensure I wasn't being followed by something that shouldn't exist. I never went back. I hired a moving company to retrieve my things, instructing them to leave the radio behind. When they returned, they reported that the house felt wrong somehow, that they'd worked as quickly as possible to get out. One of the movers mentioned hearing what sounded like radio broadcasts coming from inside the walls, but when they'd checked, no equipment was powered on. Months later, I learned that the house had been sold again, to another unsuspecting buyer who'd gotten a great deal on a property with character. I thought about warning them, about calling to explain what they'd gotten themselves into, but who would believe such a story? Instead, I sometimes find myself listening to old radio frequencies late at night, scanning through static and hoping I won't hear that familiar announcer's voice describing new incidents at 1247 Maple Street. Because I know the cycle continues, that somewhere another person is discovering an old radio in a garage, tuning into broadcasts from the past that are slowly, inexorably, bringing the past into their present. The static between worlds is thinning, and each listener makes it thinner still. Story 13. Some places exist in the gaps between what maps dare to show. This lighthouse was one of them, a skeletal tower of weathered stone rising from an island that shouldn't have been there, its presence a violation of every navigational chart I'd ever studied. I'd found reference to it in maritime records dating back to 1847, buried in the archives of the Coastal Survey Office like a shameful secret. The entries were sparse, clinical. Unnamed beacon, operational status unknown, approach not recommended. No coordinates, no official designation, just a smudge of ink that suggested something had once existed in the empty waters off the Maine coast. The boat I'd chartered dropped me at the rocky shore with obvious reluctance. The captain's weathered hands had trembled slightly as he handed me my pack, and he'd muttered something about picking me up the next morning if conditions allowed. His eyes had avoided mine when he said it, and the diesel engine's roar couldn't quite mask the uncertainty in his voice. The island felt wrong from the moment my boots touched the barnacle-crusted rocks. The air hung too still, as if the usual maritime winds had forgotten this place existed. Seagulls that should have been wheeling overhead were conspicuously absent, leaving only the rhythmic crash of waves against stone to break the oppressive silence. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its white-painted exterior streaked with rust stains that looked disturbingly organic in the pale afternoon light. Windows dotted the tower's surface like dead eyes, their glass long since shattered or gone entirely. Yet despite its obvious decay, something about the structure seemed to pulse with a subtle vitality that made my skin crawl. I approached the entrance through tall grass that whispered against my legs with each step. The wooden door hung askew on corroded hinges, revealing a slice of darkness beyond that seemed to swallow light, rather than simply lacking it. My flashlight beam flickered nervously as I tested it, the LED casting harsh shadows that danced and writhed with each minor movement of my hand. The first thing I noticed upon crossing the threshold was the smell. Not the expected mustiness of abandonment, but something cleaner, almost antiseptic. It reminded me of hospitals or laboratories, sterile and wrong in a place that should have reeked of salt spray and decay. My footsteps echoed hollowly on the stone floor, each sound seeming to bounce back from impossible distances. The interior spiral staircase wound upward into shadows my flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. Iron railings, eaten through with rust holes, provided minimal support as I began my ascent. Each step produced a metallic groan that seemed to reverberate through the entire structure, as if the lighthouse itself was commenting on my intrusion. Halfway up, I paused to catch my breath, and noticed something that made my heart stammer in my chest. Despite the obviously broken condition of the lighthouse's beacon, I could see shattered lens fragments scattered on the steps above. A soft, even glow was emanating from somewhere overhead. Not electric light, but something more organic, pulsing gently like a slow heartbeat made visible. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Phosphorescent algae, perhaps, or some kind of chemical reaction caused by the ocean air interacting with the lighthouse's metal components. But even as I formed these theories, part of me knew they were inadequate, desperate attempts to impose logic on something that existed outside its boundaries. The glow intensified as I climbed higher, and with it came a sensation I initially mistook for dizziness. The air seemed to thicken around me, taking on an almost liquid quality that made each breath feel like drinking rather than breathing. My pulse hammered in my ears, so loud I was certain it would mask any other sounds that might be hiding in the lighthouse's depths. But there were other sounds, soft footsteps that didn't quite match my own rhythm, always just out of sync, always seeming to come from the steps either directly above or below me. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started again, they resumed after the briefest hesitation, as if whatever was making them needed a moment to remember how walking was supposed to work. By the time I reached the lamp room at the lighthouse's peak, my shirt was soaked through with cold sweat, and my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. The circular chamber was empty except for the remains of the great lens, its shattered pieces scattered across the floor like frozen tears. Yet the room was filled with that impossible light, emanating from no visible source but bright enough to render my flashlight completely useless. That's when I saw them. They moved through the light with the fluid grace of underwater creatures, their forms translucent and shifting, barely more substantial than smoke given shape by will alone, human-like in their basic proportions but wrong in countless subtle ways, limbs that bent at slightly incorrect angles, faces that suggested features without quite committing to them, movements that flowed like liquid mercury rather than following the normal mechanics of bone and muscle. There were dozens of them, maybe more, walking endless circuits around the lamp room's perimeter. Their feet made no sound against the stone floor, but I could hear their passage as a soft whisper, like wind through dry leaves or the distant rush of blood through arteries. They paid me no attention at first, continuing their mindless procession as if I were merely another piece of the lighthouse's abandoned furniture. My first instinct was to flee, but my legs felt disconnected from my will, heavy and unresponsive as if the strange light was affecting my nervous system. Instead, I found myself studying the creatures more closely, trying to understand what I was seeing. Their translucent bodies seemed to contain swirling galaxies of dimmer light, constellations of luminous particles that shifted and flowed with each movement. It was only when I looked down at my own shadow that true terror took hold. The lighthouse's impossible illumination should have cast my shadow clearly on the stone floor, dark and familiar and reassuringly solid. Instead, I saw only a faint outline, barely perceptible, as if I were fading from existence, one photon at a time. Even as I watched, horrified, the shadow grew lighter still, its edges becoming increasingly indistinct. I raised my hand and watched its shadow waver like heat shimmer, growing more transparent with each passing second. The implications crashed over me with the force of a physical blow. Whatever was happening to these creatures, whatever had transformed them from solid human beings into these luminous phantoms, it was happening to me as well. The whispered footsteps around me seemed to grow more insistent, and I realized with growing panic that some of the creatures had stopped their endless walking to turn their not-quite faces in my direction. Their attention felt like ice water in my veins, a cold recognition that pierced through whatever supernatural effect was dissolving my physical form. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice emerged as little more than a hoarse whisper. The sound seemed to excite the creatures, and more of them began to pause in their circuits, their translucent forms clustering closer. I could see now that their faces weren't entirely featureless. There were suggestions of eyes, dark hollows that might once have held human recognition and consciousness. One of them approached me directly, moving with that same fluid grace, but with obvious intent. As it drew near, I caught a glimpse of what might have been expression on its shifting features, not malevolence, but something far worse. Recognition. Welcome. The patient satisfaction of one who has been waiting a very long time for company. My shadow was now barely visible, a ghost of an outline that flickered like a candle flame in wind. The creature extended what might have been a hand toward me, and I saw that its palm contained the same swirling galaxies of light that filled all their forms. Where that hand touched my arm, my flesh grew cold and began to take on the same translucent quality. Panic finally broke through whatever supernatural lethargy had been holding me in place. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the broken lens fragments, and threw myself toward the spiral staircase. The creatures didn't pursue me, but their whispered presence seemed to follow, a subtle pressure at the edges of my consciousness that suggested they knew I couldn't escape what was already beginning. The descent was a nightmare of stumbling feet and racing heartbeat. My shadow continued to fade with each step, and I could feel something fundamental about my physical existence becoming increasingly tenuous. The lighthouse's strange illumination seemed to be inside me now, replacing whatever normally held my cells and tissues together with something entirely other. I burst through the entrance door and into the fading daylight of early evening, gasping salt air that tasted like salvation. But even outside the lighthouse's direct influence, my shadow remained weak, barely perceptible on the rocky ground. The transformation had been slowed but not stopped. The chartered boat was waiting offshore, exactly as promised, its captain scanning the darkening horizon with obvious anxiety. I waded into the surf and hauled myself aboard, my limbs feeling increasingly insubstantial with each movement. The captain took one look at my condition and started the engine without a word, his face pale with an understanding that went beyond simple fear. As we pulled away from the island, I turned back to see the lighthouse beginning to glow, with that same impossible illumination I'd witnessed in the lamp room. The light pulsed rhythmically, like a beacon designed not to guide ships to safety but to call something home. In its pale radiance, I could see dozens of translucent figures emerging from the structure to walk along the rocky shore, their forms beautiful and terrible in the gathering darkness. The boat's engine roared as we raced toward the mainland, but I knew with sick certainty that distance alone wouldn't save me. Whatever process had begun in that accursed lighthouse was continuing, working its way through my cellular structure like a slow-acting poison. My shadow was now completely gone, leaving me standing in the boat's harsh deck lights without casting even the faintest silhouette. By the time we reached port, my hands had begun to take on that familiar translucent quality, galaxies of light swirling beneath skin that was rapidly becoming more suggestion than substance. The captain helped me to the dock without meeting my eyes, his weathered hands passing through mine as if I were made of morning mist. I write these words now with fingers that barely disturb the keyboard, my physical form becoming increasingly negotiable with each passing hour. The lighthouse calls to me across the dark water, its impossible beacon promising reunion with others who have undergone this same transformation. I understand now that it was never truly abandoned. It's been populated all along by those who, like me, discovered too late that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The process is nearly complete. Soon I'll return to that unnamed island, taking my place among the luminous prisoners who walk eternal circuits in the lamp room's strange light. But until then, I offer this warning to anyone who might be tempted to seek out places that exist in the gaps between known things. Some discoveries exact a price that can never be fully paid, only eternally endured. Story 14. The smell hit me first. Stale popcorn mixed with decades of accumulated dust and something else, something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in standing water. The neon sign outside the Paramount Theater flickered erratically, casting intermittent shadows across the cracked sidewalk, and I should have turned around right then. Should have listened to the primal instinct screaming at me to keep walking. But curiosity, that fatal human flaw, anchored my feet to the pavement. I'd passed this building countless times over the past 15 years, watching it decay behind boarded windows and peeling paint. The Paramount had been shuttered since the early 80s, another casualty of multiplexes and streaming services. So when I noticed the restored marquee advertising classic films daily showings, my first emotion was mild surprise, followed quickly by nostalgic interest. The elderly man behind the concession stand moved with the deliberate slowness of someone carrying too many years on his shoulders. When I approached, he looked up with rheumy eyes that seemed to focus somewhere just past my left ear. I mentioned wanting to see whatever was playing, and he nodded slowly, sliding a worn ticket across the counter without naming a price. His fingers, I noticed, were unnaturally pale, almost translucent in the dim lobby lighting. The theater itself retained its old-world grandeur despite obvious signs of neglect. Burgundy velvet seats, though faded and threadbare in places, still held their elegant curves. The ceiling, painted with cherubs and clouds in better decades, now bore water stains that looked disturbingly like faces in my peripheral vision. I chose a seat in the middle section, close enough to appreciate the details but far enough back to take in the full screen. The lights dimmed with a mechanical grinding that resonated through the floorboards and into my bones. What appeared on screen made my breath catch in my throat. There I was, filmed apparently from across the street, walking out of my apartment building that very morning. The image quality was grainy, reminiscent of old surveillance footage, but the subject was unmistakably me. Same jacket, same tired posture, same unconscious habit of checking my phone while walking. My heart began beating faster, a rhythmic hammering that seemed to echo in the vast empty theater. I told myself it had to be some kind of mistake, perhaps footage shot for a documentary about urban life, with me as an unwitting background character. But as the film continued, following my mundane journey to the coffee shop on 5th Street, capturing my interaction with the barista and my selection of a corner table, the rational explanations began crumbling. The camera angles were impossible. Shots from inside the coffee shop positioned as if someone had been sitting directly across from me, despite my clear memory of that table being empty. Overhead angles that could only have been captured by floating several feet above my head. And throughout each scene, barely visible in the shadows and reflections, stood figures that definitely had not been there in reality. They were tall, impossibly thin, draped in what appeared to be tattered fabric that moved independently of any wind. Their faces, when glimpsed, were pale smudges with dark hollows where eyes should be. In the coffee shop footage, one stood just behind my chair, close enough that I should have felt its presence, its breathing. Another lingered by the window, its form partly translucent, watching me through the glass. My mouth went dry. Sweat began collecting along my hairline despite the theater's chill. I gripped the armrests of my seat, the worn velvet ruff against my palms, and tried to convince myself this was an elaborate prank or some kind of performance art. But the details were too accurate, too intimate. The film showed me checking my watch, the same watch I was wearing now, at exactly the moment I remembered doing so that morning. The footage followed me home, capturing my evening routine with voyeuristic precision. There I was, visible through my apartment windows, preparing dinner, settling down to watch television, completely unaware of being observed. And in every shot, the spectral figures were present. One stood in the corner of my living room, motionless as a coat rack, but undeniably there. Another seemed to emerge from the shadows behind my couch, leaning forward as if listening to my thoughts. When the film ended, the theater fell into absolute silence. No credits rolled. The screen simply went black, and the lights remained dim. I sat there for several minutes, my hands trembling slightly, trying to process what I had witnessed. The logical part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Hidden cameras, digital manipulation, some kind of elaborate setup. But logic felt thin and insubstantial against the growing dread settling in my chest like cold water. I left quickly, not acknowledging the old man who watched me go with those unfocused eyes. Sleep eluded me that night. Every shadow in my apartment seemed to hold potential menace. Every creak of the building settling sounded like footsteps. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks, peering out windows, examining corners where darkness pooled too deeply. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that paranoia was taking hold, that I was allowing a strange experience to unhinge my normally steady nerves. But when I closed my eyes, I could see those figures with perfect clarity, the way they moved without seeming to walk, how their attention focused on me with predatory intensity. The next evening, I returned to the Paramount. I told myself I needed to understand what was happening, to prove to myself that the previous night had been some kind of misunderstanding or technical error. The same elderly man occupied the concession stand, and he regarded me with what might have been the faintest smile as he slid another ticket across the counter. This time, the film began with footage from that very day. I watched myself at work, sitting at my desk, attending a brief meeting with colleagues. But the figures were more prominent now, no longer confined to shadows and peripheries. One stood directly behind my chair during the meeting, its elongated form clearly visible against the conference room wall. Another seemed to lean over my shoulder as I typed, its presence so close to my neck that I instinctively reached up to touch the spot, finding my skin cold despite the theater's stagnant air. Most disturbing was how the figures had begun interacting with my environment. In one scene, papers on my desk moved slightly, rustling as if touched by invisible hands. A coffee cup shifted position between shots. My computer screen flickered momentarily, displaying what looked like old film grain before returning to normal. The footage showed me leaving work, walking the familiar route home, but now the figures followed openly. They glided alongside me on the sidewalk, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, maintaining a loose formation like predators circling prey. Other pedestrians walked through them without reaction, suggesting that only I, and apparently this mysterious camera, could perceive their presence. My breathing became shallow, quick gasps that couldn't seem to deliver enough oxygen. The theater air felt thick, oppressive, pressing against my skin like a heavy blanket. I wanted to leave, but found myself unable to look away from the screen, transfixed by the horrible intimacy of watching my own life unfold under supernatural surveillance. The figures had grown more defined with each scene. Their faces, while still indistinct, now suggested features, hollow eye sockets, mouths that might have been wounds, skin that appeared to shift and ripple like water, and they were looking directly at the camera now, acknowledging its presence, sometimes even seeming to pose for it. When the film ended, I remained seated for a long time, my heart hammering against my ribs. The silence felt weighted, expectant, as if the theater itself was holding its breath. I finally forced myself to stand on unsteady legs and walk toward the exit, but I could feel something watching me go. Not just the old man behind the concession stand, but something else, something that existed in the spaces between the flickering light and shadow. The third night, I knew I shouldn't return. Every rational impulse screamed against it, but the compulsion was stronger than reason, an irresistible need to see what would happen next, to follow this bizarre narrative to its conclusion. I felt like a character in one of those horror stories where the protagonist makes obviously poor decisions, except now I understood the terrible logic of such choices. Sometimes you have to see the monster clearly before you can begin to fight it. The footage this time was even more recent, capturing events from just hours before. I watched myself grocery shopping, the figures now moving with obvious purpose rather than merely observing. They reached through me to knock items from shelves, their incorporeal hands somehow affecting the physical world. They whispered to each other, I could see their mouths moving, though no sound accompanied the gestures, and pointed at me with elongated fingers that seemed to stretch longer than human anatomy should allow. But the most disturbing development was their growing solidity. What had begun as translucent suggestions of forms now appeared increasingly substantial. Their edges were sharper, their movements more fluid and confident. In one scene, filmed in the produce section, one of the figures cast a faint shadow on the floor. They were becoming real. My hands were shaking so violently now that I had to clench them into fists to maintain any control. Cold sweat ran down my back, and my breath came in short, desperate gasps. The theater around me seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart, the walls breathing in rhythm with my terror. The footage showed me walking home, but this time the figures were no longer content to simply follow. They pressed closer, sometimes appearing to brush against me. In several frames, I could see myself react. A slight stumble, a shiver, my hand moving unconsciously to my neck or shoulder, as if brushing away something I couldn't consciously perceive. As the film progressed, I began to notice something else. The theater around me was no longer completely empty. In my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of movement in the other seats. When I turned to look directly, I saw nothing but empty velvet and shadow. But when I focused on the screen again, I could sense presence behind me, beside me, filling the theater with patient, watching forms. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. My breath began to mist slightly in the air, and the hair on my arms stood up as if charged with static electricity. The boundary between the film and reality was dissolving, the figures on screen somehow bleeding into the physical space around me. On screen, the footage showed me entering my building, climbing the stairs to my apartment. But instead of ending there, the camera somehow followed me inside, capturing intimate moments I had believed private and secure. I watched myself preparing for bed, brushing my teeth, checking the locks one final time before settling down for the night. And in every frame, the figures were there, closer than ever before, some standing directly beside my bed, others positioned throughout the apartment like silent sentinels. Their faces were now clearly visible, gaunt, hollow-eyed visages that spoke of hunger and patient malevolence. They watched me sleep with predatory focus, occasionally leaning down as if to whisper in my ear or touch my face with those impossibly long fingers. The film continued past what should have been its natural conclusion, showing me tossing restlessly, trapped in dreams I couldn't remember but that left me exhausted upon waking. The figures moved freely through these scenes, no longer bound by the pretense of being mere observers. They rearranged objects in my apartment, stood over me while I slept, seemed to draw some kind of sustenance from my presence. The screen flickered, and suddenly the footage changed perspective. Instead of watching myself from external cameras, I was now seeing through my own eyes, experiencing my morning routine from a first-person viewpoint. But overlaid on this footage were the figures, visible now in my direct line of sight, rather than lurking in shadows and reflections. They stood in my bathroom while I shaved, their forms reflected in the mirror behind my own image. They followed me to the kitchen, reaching through me to touch the coffee maker, the refrigerator, marking territory with their ethereal presence. And when I looked directly at the camera, when the film me looked directly ahead, the figures looked back, their hollow eyes meeting mine with recognition and what might have been anticipation. The footage was showing me leaving my apartment to come to the theater. I was watching myself make the journey I had completed less than an hour ago, seeing my own face filled with the same determination and dread I had felt walking those familiar streets. The figures accompanied me every step, growing more solid with each block, their forms gaining definition and substance. And as the film me approached the Paramount Theater, as I watched myself purchase a ticket from the pale old man and enter the auditorium, I realized with horrible clarity what was happening. The figures weren't just being recorded. They were using the film as a medium, a bridge between their realm and mine. Each viewing strengthened their connection to this reality, gave them more power to manifest in the physical world. The screen showed me taking my seat, showed the lights dimming, showed the film beginning. And in that recursive moment, as I watched myself watching the screen, the figures began to move with purpose toward the front of the theater, toward the boundary between projection and reality. My heart was beating so fast now that my vision blurred at the edges. My hands gripped the armrests with enough force to leave permanent impressions in the worn velvet. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt paralyzed, useless. The air in the theater had grown so thick it felt like drowning in slow motion. On screen, the figures pressed against the inner surface of the projection, their forms distorting as they pushed against that invisible barrier. The image began to warp and ripple, as if the screen itself was becoming flexible, permeable. And I could see them in the theater now, not just in my peripheral vision but directly ahead, climbing out of the projection like moths emerging from cocoons. They moved with fluid grace, their elongated limbs flowing like water given form. The first one to fully emerge turned those hollow eyes directly toward me, and I felt recognition pass between us, predator and prey finally meeting without the buffer of recorded footage. Its mouth opened, revealing darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the theater's dim lighting. More figures pulled themselves free from the screen, each one more solid than the last, their forms casting real shadows on the theater floor. They moved toward me with deliberate slowness, savoring my terror, feeding on the fear that radiated from my body like heat from a fever. I finally found the strength to stand, my legs shaking so violently I nearly fell. The figures paused, watching my movement with tilted heads, like curious predators studying unusual prey behavior. I backed toward the aisle, never taking my eyes off them, my breath coming in harsh gasps that echoed in the vast space. But as I reached the aisle, I discovered I wasn't alone in the theater after all. More figures occupied the seats behind me, dozens of them, all turning in unison to watch my retreat. They had been there all along, I realized, growing stronger with each viewing, waiting for enough substance to reveal themselves fully. The elderly man at the concession stand, I understood now that he was part of this, had always been part of this, a curator of some kind, feeding the figures with fresh victims drawn by curiosity and the promise of entertainment. His role was to lure people in, to provide the human presence these entities needed to anchor themselves to reality. I ran then, pushing past the spectral forms that reached for me with those impossibly long fingers, feeling their touch like ice water against my skin. They didn't try to stop me, not yet, but I could feel their attention following me, marking me, claiming me for future encounters. I burst through the theater doors into the night air, gasping and shaking, my clothes soaked with cold sweat. Behind me, the Paramount's neon sign flickered more erratically than before, and I could see shapes moving behind the windows, pressing against the glass like fish in an aquarium. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't returned to the theater, but I know it doesn't matter. The connection has been established, the bridge built. I see them now in my daily life, no longer confined to recorded footage but present in my actual reality. They stand in corners of my apartment, follow me to work, observe my every movement with patient hunger. They're waiting for something, building towards some kind of culmination. Each day they grow more solid, more present, their influence over my environment increasing. Objects move when I'm not looking. My reflection sometimes shows additional figures standing behind me, and I've begun to notice other people, strangers on the street, who carry the same haunted look I see in my own mirror, the expression of someone being perpetually watched by things that shouldn't exist. The Paramount Theater still advertises classic films, daily showings, on its restored marquee. Sometimes, late at night, I see people entering, drawn by the same curiosity that led me there. I want to warn them, to explain what they're walking into, but I know they wouldn't believe me. And perhaps that's for the best, because I'm beginning to suspect that knowledge of the figures makes them stronger, that awareness feeds their ability to manifest. The more you understand their nature, the more real they become in your life. And I fear I understand far too much already. Tonight, I can see one standing at the foot of my bed, more solid than ever before, its hollow eyes fixed on mine with what might be anticipation. Its mouth moves as if speaking, though I hear no words. But somehow, I understand the message anyway. Soon, it seems to say. Very soon now. And I realize that I may never have actually left the theater at all. Story 15. Time doesn't stop. It never has. Not once in the history of the universe. Until today. Until this moment when I stand frozen among trees that have forgotten how to sway, watching leaves that refuse to fall, breathing air that tastes of endings. The trail had seemed ordinary enough when I started. Packed earth beneath my hiking boots, familiar crunch of autumn debris, the steady rhythm of my breathing mixing with distant bird calls and the whisper of wind through branches. I'd taken this path dozens of times before, seeking solitude in the dense pine forest that stretched for miles beyond my cabin. The routine had become my sanctuary after months of sleepless nights and frayed nerves, a divorce that gutted my life, a job that demanded everything and gave nothing back, relationships that withered under the weight of my increasing isolation. But today was different from the first step. The morning had started wrong. My coffee tasted metallic, bitter in a way that made my tongue recoil. The newspaper on my doorstep was blank, completely blank. White pages that should have held yesterday's headlines but showed nothing except the faint impression of text that had never been printed. I'd stared at those empty pages for longer than made sense, turning them over and over, searching for some explanation that wouldn't come. I should have stayed home. Instead, I'd laced up my boots and headed into the woods, craving the predictable comfort of solitude and silence. What I found was something else entirely. Silence that felt hungry. Solitude that pressed against my skin like a living thing. The first sign was subtle. A robin had been singing somewhere ahead, its voice bright and clear in the crisp October air. Then it stopped. Not gradually, not fading as I walked past. It simply ended mid-note, as if someone had severed the sound with a blade. I paused, listening for the continuation that never came, my heart doing an odd little skip against my ribs. Birds stopped singing all the time, nothing unusual about that. But then the wind died. Not a gentle cessation, not the natural ebb and flow of air currents, but an abrupt cutoff that left the trees standing motionless, their branches frozen in whatever position they'd held when the breeze simply ended. The sudden stillness pressed against my eardrums, creating a vacuum of sound that made me want to cough, to stamp my feet, to make some noise to fill the growing void. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud against the forest floor. Each step crunched with exaggerated clarity, echoing off trees that stood like silent sentinels. The sound of my own breathing became amplified, rasping in and out with mechanical precision. My pulse thundered in my ears, too fast, too irregular. I kept walking. What else was there to do? The path curved ahead, disappearing around a cluster of ancient oaks whose bark looked darker than I remembered, more textured, as if shadows had seeped into the wood itself. As I approached the bend, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. A leaf falling from one of the overhead branches, drifting down in that lazy spiral leaves make when they finally let go. But this leaf wasn't falling. It hung suspended in midair, maybe 3 feet from the ground, completely motionless, perfectly still, as if the air around it had solidified into glass. I stopped walking. My breath caught in my throat, harsh and sudden. The leaf remained frozen, caught in its descent, defying every law of physics I'd ever understood. I reached out with one trembling hand, my fingers passing within inches of the suspended leaf. The air felt thick, viscous, like trying to move through invisible honey. That's when I noticed the others. All around me, scattered throughout the forest, leaves hung motionless in various stages of their fall. Some were barely inches from their branches, others suspended at different heights, creating a three-dimensional snapshot of autumn caught in the act of becoming. The sight made my vision blur, made my knees weak. I grabbed the nearest tree trunk for support, bark rough and unnaturally warm against my palm. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air, cold droplets that ran down my temples and made me shiver. My mouth felt stuffed with cotton, tongue thick and useless. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. I forced myself to continue down the path, each step requiring conscious effort, as if I were pushing through increasingly dense atmosphere. The suspended leaves created an obstacle course of impossible physics, and I found myself ducking and weaving around them, afraid that touching even one might shatter whatever fragile balance kept reality from completely unraveling. The silence deepened with every step. Not just the absence of sound, but something more profound. The absence of the possibility of sound. Even my footsteps began to fade, growing softer and softer until they made no noise at all. I stamped my foot deliberately, as hard as I could, and heard nothing. The sound simply disappeared before it could exist. That's when true panic set in. My chest tightened, ribs constricting around lungs that suddenly couldn't pull in enough air. Hyperventilation made black spots dance at the edges of my vision. I pressed my hands to my throat, feeling my pulse rapid and thready beneath my fingers, but hearing nothing. No heartbeat, no breath, no sound of blood rushing through my veins. I tried to call out, to scream, to make any noise that might break this terrible spell. My mouth opened, my vocal cords strained, but the silence swallowed everything before it could be born. The effort left my throat raw and aching, Ahead, the forest path opened into a small clearing I'd never seen before, though I'd walked this trail countless times. In the center of the clearing stood something that made my already fragile grip on reality slip another notch, a circle of trees that couldn't have grown naturally, their trunks perfectly spaced, their branches intertwining overhead to form a dome of living wood. And within that circle, movement. Not the movement of living things, but something else entirely. Shapes that flickered at the periphery of vision, translucent and shifting, like heat shimmer rising from summer pavement. But as I watched, they began to take more definite form. Human silhouettes, dozens of them, all turning toward me with desperate urgency. They had no faces, no features I could make out clearly, but somehow I could feel their need, their frantic desire to communicate. They pressed against the boundaries of their circle, reaching out with arms that seemed to stretch and distort, mouths opening in silent screams that never reached my ears. My legs moved without conscious direction, carrying me closer to the clearing despite every instinct screaming at me to run. But where could I run to? The forest behind me had become as still and silent as everything else, trapped in this moment that refused to progress. As I approached the circle of trees, the translucent figures became more agitated, their movements more frantic. One of them, taller than the rest, stepped forward and began what looked like an elaborate pantomime. Its arms moved in broad gestures, pointing first at me, then at itself, then at something beyond the trees that I couldn't see. Understanding came in fragments, pieces of meaning that assembled themselves slowly in my terror-dulled mind. The figure was trying to tell me something about time, about this moment of suspended reality. Its gestures became more urgent, more desperate, as if it knew I was running out of opportunities to comprehend. Other figures joined the first, their silent pantomime creating a chaotic ballet of desperate communication. They pointed at watches that weren't there, made circular motions with their hands, pressed palms together as if trying to hold something in place. One of them fell to its knees, hands clasped in what could have been prayer or pleading. The meaning crashed over me like a wave of ice water. These weren't ghosts or spirits. They were people who had walked this path before me. People who had encountered this same impossible silence and become trapped within it. The translucent figure pointing at me was trying to warn me, trying to tell me that I was about to join them in this eternal moment of frozen time. But there was more. The tall figure continued its frantic gesturing, pointing now at the trees themselves, at the perfect circle they formed. Its movements became more specific, more deliberate, as if trying to convey precise instructions. It pointed at me, then at the ground where I stood, then made a pushing motion toward the trees. I was the key. Somehow, impossibly, I was the element that could break this temporal prison. The realization came with a surge of adrenaline that cut through my paralysis. These people, these trapped souls, they needed me to do something specific, something that would shatter the spell that held them and free us all from this suffocating stillness. But what? What did they need me to do? The tall figure seemed to sense my confusion. It moved closer to the edge of its circle, close enough that I could see more detail in its translucent form. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing what looked like hiking clothes not unlike my own. His mouth moved in exaggerated motions, as if he were shouting words I couldn't hear. I pressed closer to the invisible barrier that seemed to separate us, close enough that I could almost make out what he was trying to say. His lips formed shapes, repeated patterns that slowly began to make sense. He was saying my name. Somehow, impossibly, he knew my name. But more than that, he was telling me something else, something that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. He was telling me that I had been here before, that I had walked this path, encountered this silence, become trapped in this moment, and somehow escaped, only to forget, only to return, only to face the same choice again. The other figures pressed forward, their silent voices joining his in what I could only assume was a chorus of confirmation. They knew me. They had seen me here before, had watched me make whatever choice would free them temporarily, only to reset the cycle once again. My legs gave out. I collapsed to my knees, hands pressed to the earth that felt solid but somehow wrong. as if it were only an approximation of ground, a memory of what dirt should feel like. The truth of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't the first time. This wasn't even the second or third time. I had been trapped in this loop for who knows how long, walking the same path, encountering the same silence, learning the same terrible truth, making the same choice to free the others while condemning myself to forget and repeat the cycle. The tall figure continued his silent shouting, his gestures becoming more frantic. He was pointing at something specific now, a gap between two of the trees, a space in the circle that looked no different from any other part of the boundary, but apparently held special significance. I understood. To free them, I had to take their place. I had to step into that circle, become another translucent figure trying desperately to warn the next poor soul who would walk this path. The cycle would continue, but they would be free to move on to whatever came after this frozen moment. But this time felt different. This time, instead of the resigned acceptance that must have characterized my previous encounters with this choice, I felt something else. Anger. Rage at being trapped, fury at having my memory wiped, indignation at being forced to make the same sacrifice over and over again. That anger gave me clarity. Instead of stepping toward the circle, I stepped back. Instead of accepting the role of warning ghost, I looked for another option. The trees. The perfectly spaced trees that formed this prison. They were too perfect, too deliberate. They weren't natural growth. They were a construction, a cage built by someone or something that needed this loop to continue. I circled the clearing, ignoring the increasingly frantic gestures of the trapped figures, studying the trees that formed their prison. At the base of each trunk, barely visible beneath fallen leaves and moss, I could see symbols carved into the bark. Ancient-looking marks that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked directly at them. The symbols were what maintained the loop. The symbols were what kept time frozen, what trapped the spirits, what erased my memory each time I chose sacrifice over escape. Without hesitation, I pulled my hiking knife from my belt and began scratching at the nearest symbol, gouging deep marks through the carved lines. The moment my blade touched the carving, reality shuddered. The silence cracked like glass, letting through the first sounds I'd heard in what felt like hours. My own ragged breathing, the scrape of metal against wood, the distant call of a bird that had finally remembered how to sing. The translucent figures in the clearing flickered, their forms becoming more solid, more real. The tall figure looked directly at me, and for the first time I heard his voice, faint but audible. "Thank you," he said, and his words carried the weight of countless repetitions, countless failed attempts, countless loops finally broken. One by one, I moved around the circle, destroying each symbol with methodical precision. With each carved line I obliterated, time lurched forward another increment. Leaves resumed their fall. Wind began to whisper through branches. My own heartbeat returned to my ears like a welcome drumbeat. By the time I reached the final tree, the figures in the clearing had become fully solid, fully human. They stood blinking in confusion, looking around as if waking from a long dream. Without a word, they began walking away, dispersing into the forest that had finally remembered how to move. The tall figure was the last to leave. He approached me as I finished destroying the final symbol, his face now clear and detailed, kind eyes, graying beard, expression of profound gratitude mixed with something that might have been pity. He spoke quietly, his voice carrying an odd echo as if it were coming from very far away. He told me that I had been brave, that I had finally found the solution that had eluded me through dozens of cycles. But he also told me something else, something that made my blood run cold. Breaking the loop hadn't freed me from it. It had only changed my role. Now, instead of being the one who walked into the trap, I would be the one who maintained it. The forest would need a guardian, someone to ensure that others didn't stumble into the same temporal prison, someone to guide them away before they could become caught in a new cycle. As he walked away, disappearing between the trees that no longer formed a perfect circle, I felt the change beginning. My connection to linear time grew tenuous. My form started to take on that translucent quality I had seen in the others. But I wasn't trapped in a single moment. I was spread across all moments, able to move through the forest at any time, able to intercept hikers before they walked too far down the wrong path. I return to my cabin each evening, though I'm never sure if it's the same evening or a different one. I eat meals that taste like memories of food, sleep in a bed that feels like an approximation of rest, and every morning, I walk the trails, watching for visitors who venture too deep into the woods, gently steering them away from paths that lead to silence. Sometimes, late at night, I can hear the forest whispering, not with malice, but with gratitude. It knows I've become its protector, its guardian against the kind of temporal wounds that once trapped so many souls. The weight of that responsibility sits heavy on my shoulders, but it's a burden I've chosen rather than one forced upon me. The silence still lives in the deep woods, waiting for the unwary. But now it has to get past me first, and I've learned that some kinds of stillness are meant to be broken. Some kinds of quiet are meant to be filled with warning voices. I am the voice that calls hikers back from the edge of forever. I am the shadow that blocks the paths to nowhere. I am the guardian of moments that refuse to pass, ensuring they remain exactly where they belong. In the past, where broken time can't trap the living. And sometimes, just sometimes, I catch glimpses of the ones I freed, living their lives in the world beyond the trees, growing old in real time, dying natural deaths when their moments finally come. It's enough. It has to be enough. The forest remembers everything, and now so do I. Story 16. The silence in Blackwood Manor pressed against my eardrums like water at the bottom of a deep well. Even my breathing seemed intrusive in the vast foyer, where dust motes danced in thin shafts of afternoon light filtering through grimy windows. The promotional flyer had promised an intimate tour of a recently restored historic mansion, but I appeared to be the only visitor foolish enough to venture out on this dreary Tuesday afternoon. My footsteps echoed as I crossed the marble floor toward the information placard near the grand staircase. The sound bounced off the high ceiling and returned to me oddly distorted, as if someone else entirely had taken that step. I paused, tilting my head to listen, but heard only the settling groans of old wood and the distant hum of modern heating systems fighting against centuries of accumulated cold. The mansion's history, according to the brass plaque, stretched back to 1847, when railroad magnate Cornelius Blackwood built it as a wedding gift for his bride. She had died within the first year of their marriage, though the cause was listed merely as sudden illness. Cornelius himself had lived as a recluse until his death in 1902, after which the property passed through a succession of owners who never seemed to stay long. I moved into the first room, what had once been a formal dining room. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and again that strange echo returned, not quite matching the sound I'd made. It was subtly different, as if the mansion itself was trying to mimic my movements but couldn't quite get the rhythm right. My pulse quickened slightly, though I dismissed it as nothing more than the acoustics of an old building. The dining room held an enormous mahogany table surrounded by 12 chairs, their velvet upholstery faded to the color of dried blood. Portrait paintings lined the walls, their subjects' eyes seeming to track my movement through the room. I approached one of the larger paintings, a stern-faced woman in Victorian dress with pale skin and dark, sunken eyes. Her nameplate read, Eleanor Blackwood, 1825-1848. I cleared my throat to break the oppressive quiet, and the sound that came back wasn't quite right. Where my throat clearing had been a simple, brief noise, the echo stretched longer, taking on an almost questioning tone. The hair on my arms stood up. I cleared my throat again, more deliberately this time, listening carefully to what returned. The echo came back warped, twisted into something that sounded almost like a whisper. My mouth went dry as I strained to make out what it might be saying, but the sound faded before I could be certain I'd heard anything at all. Moving through the mansion's lower floor, I found myself unconsciously walking more quietly, though this only made the distorted echoes more noticeable. In the library, my soft footfalls on the Persian rug generated responses that sounded like multiple people walking just slightly out of sync with me. The sensation of being followed crawled up my spine, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly. The library walls were lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, many with titles I couldn't make out in languages I didn't recognize. A ladder on wheels provided access to the higher shelves, and as I moved it aside to examine some of the books, the metallic screech it made was answered by what sounded unmistakably like a human cry of pain. I froze, my hands still gripping the ladder's rails, sweat beginning to bead on my forehead despite the mansion's chill. I called out, asking if anyone else was there, but received no normal response. Instead, my words came back twisted and multiplied, as if passed through several different voices before returning to me. Each repetition was slightly different, and I could swear I heard actual words hidden in the distortions, fragments like help and trapped and don't leave. My breathing grew shallow as I made my way to the staircase leading to the second floor. Each step I climbed produced not just my own echo, but what sounded like the phantom footsteps of others ascending alongside me. The banister felt ice cold under my palm, and I could smell something unpleasant. Not decay exactly, but something organic and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The second floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with doors that stood slightly ajar. The first room I entered had been a bedroom, with a 4-poster bed draped in moth-eaten curtains. As I walked across the room, the echoes of my footsteps became so distorted they no longer sounded like footsteps at all. They sounded like voices, urgent, overlapping voices all trying to speak at once. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, holding my breath, but the voices continued for several seconds after I'd stopped moving. They seemed to be coming from the very walls themselves, and I began to make out individual words among the cacophony. Someone was repeating a name, Cornelius, over and over, while another voice kept saying the basement with increasing urgency. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized the voices weren't just random sounds. They were trying to tell me something. The previous owners, the tour guides, the historians. Had any of them experienced this? Had they simply chosen not to mention the mansion's acoustic peculiarities? Or was this something that was happening only to me? I moved to the window thinking fresh air might help clear my head, but as I approached, my reflection in the glass seemed wrong. For just a moment it looked like there were other figures standing behind me in the room. I spun around but found only empty space and dust motes swirling in the fading afternoon light. The voices in the echoes were becoming clearer now, more insistent. They spoke of hidden rooms, of terrible secrets, of something that had been sealed away but was trying to claw its way back to the surface. One voice, clearer than the rest, seemed to be that of a woman. She kept repeating that I needed to find the door behind the portrait, and that time was running out. Despite every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found myself drawn deeper into the mansion. The voices were no longer just echoes of my own sounds. They were speaking independently now, a constant undercurrent of whispered conversation that made my skin crawl. I could feel them pulling at me, guiding me towards something I wasn't sure I wanted to find. In what had been the master bedroom, I discovered the portrait the voice had mentioned. It was larger than the others, depicting Cornelius Blackwood himself, a gaunt man with wild eyes and hands that seemed to reach out from the canvas. Behind the portrait, just as the voice had promised, was a narrow door I would have missed if not for the explicit direction. The door opened onto a steep, narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The voices grew excited as I stood at the threshold, their whispers becoming almost celebratory. But something else was rising from the darkness below, a presence that felt ancient and hungry and wrong in ways that made my body revolt at a cellular level. I descended anyway, my phone's flashlight cutting a weak beam through the blackness. The basement was older than the rest of the house, with stone walls that wept moisture and air that tasted of centuries-old secrets. In the center of the room sat an ornate chair, and arranged around it were dozens of mirrors of various sizes, all angled toward the seat. As I approached, the voices reached a fever pitch, and I began to understand what I was seeing. This was where Cornelius had spent his final years, sitting in that chair surrounded by mirrors, listening to the echoes of his own voice, until he could no longer distinguish between his words and the responses that came back to him. The mirrors had been positioned to create an acoustic phenomenon, amplifying and distorting sound until reality became indistinguishable from reflection. But the voices weren't coming from the past. They were coming from the mirrors themselves, from people who had sat in that chair and become trapped in the endless loop of echoes, their consciousness scattered across the reflective surfaces like light split through a prism. The mansion wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by the living, or by those who had once been living and were now something else entirely. I realized with growing horror that I had been adding my own voice to their chorus, with every sound I'd made since entering the mansion. Each word, each footstep, each breath had been captured and twisted, and now part of me was becoming entangled with whatever lived in those mirrors. The voices were no longer trying to warn me or guide me. They were trying to welcome me, to make me stay, to add my voice permanently to their eternal conversation. I could feel my own thoughts beginning to echo, bouncing back at me, changed and strange. When I tried to remember why I had come to the mansion, the memory felt distorted, as if it belonged to someone else. I ran, up the stairs, through the hallways, past the portraits with their watching eyes, my footsteps creating a thunderous cascade of twisted echoes behind me. The voices followed, pleading now, angry, desperate not to be left alone again in their prison of sound and reflection. But as I reached the front door and burst out into the dying daylight, I realized the worst truth of all. The echoes had followed me outside. Even now, as I sit in my car writing this account, I can hear my own voice coming back to me wrong, distorted, carrying with it the whispers of those trapped in Blackwood Manor. I am no longer certain which thoughts are my own and which are echoes from that terrible place. And sometimes when I speak, I can hear them speaking too, their voices layered beneath mine, growing stronger with each passing day. I fear I have brought something back with me, something that will never let me go. The mansion remains open to visitors, according to its website. I wonder how many others have heard the voices, and how many have chosen to stay and listen until they too became part of the chorus. I wonder if I will be strong enough to resist the growing urge to return, to sit in that chair, to finally understand what the voices are trying to tell me. I wonder if it's already too late.